Cool. Well, welcome everybody to the Secure the Village Reasonable Security 2021. It's our second year of doing a workshop, a seminar on the subject of what's reasonable security. It surfaces in a lot of different places, crossing a lot of different boundaries as well. So we're going to have the day spent on that. And this is part of the Secure the Village events in support of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, October. That included yesterday was a golf tournament, our first ever. Today is the conference. And I want to welcome everybody to the conference. I want to thank general sponsors too of Secure the Village, Miller Kaplan, our platinum sponsor, and a couple of program sponsors as well. DKKD and Dykrebel, our search folks, and BTI sponsors our financial services cybersecurity roundtable as well. So I want to just give a call out to them. I've put in the chat box, and I'm doing it once again, a location over on the Secure the Village website that has references for today, and also a link to a handout called Computing Your Summary Information Security Risk Profile. And we'll use that during the workshop portions of the morning. So make sure you get a look at that. Text me if you come on late and that's not visible to you, and I'll post it again when we get ready for the first break of this. Let's see, go back to one of the problems. I only have 3 monitors, so it's kind of hard keeping track of where we are. So, but anyway, the order of the day, we're going to have a initial panel discussion on identifying your risk exposure and your opportunities as well there. We'll then have discussion, our first worksheet, working on that. Then we'll take a break about 10:30. We'll come back and have a discussion on finding your risk tolerance, what's appropriate for you, given your particular circumstances. Have a second workshop after that on helping you calibrate your risk tolerance. And then we'll get into what are the elements of what one might call reasonable security. And the key thing about this, the whole morning, if you will, is that we're at a situation in history, frankly, where cyber is new, relatively speaking. I mean, I'm one of the old timers in the field, and I've only been around 40 years in this space. The field itself is a little bit older than that, but not much. And you compare that, for example, with accounting, where double entry bookkeeping and all goes back 500-600 years. You compare it to the law, which I think, Bob, you would say goes back to the Romans or maybe the Greeks or something like that, or the Hebrews with the law. So and that's just in Western society, leaving out the Far East and all. So there's a lot of history there. But what we're coming up to at this moment in time is reasonableness is kind of surfacing in a lot of places. It's in the law. The word appears with only somewhat of a definition, if at all. It surfaces in insurance. If you want to go buy cyber insurance, the phrase, the underwriters expect you to have reasonable security. And it certainly surfaces in the operational side, the part that I'm in and some of our other panelists are in. So that kind of brings the subject right to the fore, which is why we're now in our second year of doing this. Before we just get started into the technical details, I want to play a short video that kind of puts Secure the Village in context, what we're all about, and why we bring together people like attorneys, and you'll meet Bob in a little bit, Bob Braun, and the insurance folks, Jason, you'll meet him in a bit, and George and Barry and Chris on the operational side. So let me play this video. I'm going to share my screen. Then we'll come back to just the panelists and continue. So enjoy.
Cybersecurity isn't simple. So if you think you're about to watch a cute video with bouncy music that tells you how what you thought was hard is actually easy, and what you thought was complicated is actually just like 1, 2, 3, rest assured, this isn't it. Because cybersecurity isn't simple, and what we do weaves together law, technology, risk management, governance, public policy, education, political philosophy, psychology, and even questions of freedom and of war and peace. Cybersecurity isn't simple, but the values that motivate us are. The value that says we should treat others' information as we would like our information to be treated. That cybersecurity is an urgent civic duty for the 21st century citizen. And the value that says none of us is as smart as all of us. And that's why we're getting everyone involved, building bridges between those who dedicate their lives to cybersecurity and helping everyday citizens complete that last mile, transforming our neighbors into powerful cyber guardians. Cybersecurity isn't simple, but the values that motivate us are. And our values say that there's a seat at the table for anyone with something to contribute to the global exchange of knowledge we're building at Secure the Village. Because from the boardroom to the living room, it takes a village to secure the village.
There we go. So that's what we're about. How do we bring the village together, educate the village, and then motivate the village as well to go off and subsequently do the kinds of things that need to be done? With that, let me now introduce our panel, and I'm just going to go around the panelists and let you all say hello and what have you for a couple of minutes. Let me start with you, Barry Weber, who's a longtime friend and one of the people on the operational security and privacy sides.
There. I'm Barry Weber, a partner at Assured SPC. In a world filled with rapidly changing privacy and data protection obligations and requirements, Assured SPC is a specialized consultancy that helps mid-sized businesses achieve and maintain reasonable and defensible privacy compliance and data protection postures. I personally have a long history of running IT organizations across many industries prior to focusing on security and privacy years ago. It's that multidimensional experience common within Assured SPC that I believe our clients value. We understand the privacy and data security puzzle from cross-domain perspectives and speak languages of multiple disciplines within the organizations of our clients.
Cool, very nice. And you can see why Barry's an appropriate person, for this panel. We're very grateful to have you here. Couple of board members, a few board members. Let me go down to George Usey of Omnistruct and introduce yourself, George, if you would.
Yes, good morning. I'm George Usey with Omnistruct. I'm also really happy to be here, as well as participating with Secure the Village as one of their board members. My career got started back in the 90s, building internet or designing internet backbones and building them with the engineers for major companies. And for those of you that are a little bit more gray hair like me, you'll remember Excite at Home and Alta Vista and those kinds of brands and such. And securing the internet was our priority back then, but not necessarily the top of mind when it came to the users and the businesses that used it. And so that brought me here today to this place with Secure the Village, as well as part of Omnistruct's vision is to keep sensitive data sacred. And basically finding standards that can be used across the board in not just the ground war of cybersecurity, which is the protections, the detections, tooling, and those sorts of things that you would expect that we've been doing for years, but now the air war of what essentially is governance and policy, and even bringing the whole world together in what essentially are norms for cyber stability. And cyber risk is a very big part of that governance piece. And this is something that we do as an easy button for IT managed service providers and their high value clients. So I look forward to those risk discussions, and I hope there are some valuable takeaways for me as well, because I learn every time I participate in these community events, which is why it takes a village.
Yeah, that's a good point. Before I got into security, I was doing mathematics, teaching mathematics. And boy, I learned calculus so much better when I had to teach it than I ever did as a student, that way. And even after I'd learned it, I would learn new things. Another of our board members and panelists, also on the operations side, Chris Rose of Oriento. Say hello, Chris. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. So Chris Rose, partner at Oriento Inc. We have kind of a managed services side where we do IT, cyber, and compliance, and then we also have a consultancy side. My background personally is from the DoD space, starting in military, and then after I got out and went back to school, did a master's computer science at UCLA and an MBA, and worked for a company that Stan and I share that brought us together called MITRE, which does a lot of cybersecurity. They're kind of a cybersecurity skill set for the federal government. But myself and a lot of my business partners and our folks, we're heavy in the government compliance space, specifically most recently CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, just given our backgrounds, and then also healthcare and high trust and
all those other things that that go into, okay, so here's one perspective of reasonableness, here's another, here's yet another, and so on. One of the places where it comes in to play is certainly, well, what are the actual losses we're having, and how does that play out? And that's a segue to an introduction by yet another board member, Jason Meshko of InTouch Insurance. Jason ran the golf tournament yesterday, and in addition to his insurance expertise, boy, you'd put on a great golf tournament, sir. So
thank you. Want to thank Chris for helping out on the committee. I got a hangover, so from the golf tournament, it was a dash. And I want to thank George for running the putting contest. I'm getting accolades about George's putting contest, and also running around and helping out all the sponsors. So I want to thank them for the committee and their sponsorship. When I'm not running golf tournaments, let me back up. I'm co-founder of InTouch Insurance Services. We're a full service risk management insurance brokerage. We have two hats that we wear. One's on the risk management, one's on the insurance that are filling the gaps. I've been in the business 21 years. InTouch has been around since 2010. We specialize in about 75 to 80% of commercial business, meaning that we help businesses get out of their own way, and we provide risk management solutions and use insurance on the back end to fill the gaps. We help a lot of clients out in technology space, entertainment, a lot of data privacy, and it continues to be a challenge to get them up to snuff as far as their best practices or lack of their best practices, so they're not reactive versus proactive if there's a breach. So that is what we do, and that is our mission. We partner with insurance carriers, cybersecurity companies, compliance companies, so forth and so on, and then we use them as our trusted advisors in our bag of tricks to help the company succeed and not get a breach. So that's our mission.
yeah,
And, good seeing everybody.
cool. Well, good to see you here as well. And I understand the hangover part of last night was
The
fun.
hangovers,
Yeah.
one of our board members lost his glasses. I picked up the glasses. It's it was a collective effort yesterday, but we're getting a lot of accolades from it. And I think we're onto something for next year. We had over 100 people there yesterday, so it was good.
Yeah.
So,
And it's another illustration of the village. and the power of the village and the need for the village and so on. So let me move over to longtime friend and colleague Bob Braun as well. Bob, you and I started thinking together about cybersecurity, going back almost 20 years. We've been collaborating on this. So please say a few words about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, you guys probably should be happy I'm the only lawyer on the panel, which means this will probably go a lot better. And you can make lawyer jokes. I'm a transactional partner, Jeffrey Mangels, Butler, and Mitchell. I co-chair our cybersecurity and privacy group. I've actually been involved in tech and privacy and cybersecurity for nearly 40 years because I began to do this through the banking industry, where I used to be a bank regulatory lawyer at a time when banks, first of all, were moving their technology into more modern technologies, and they began to have to worry about the security of that, of their data. And secondly, because changes in the regulations, they started being able to cross market, and then people started wondering about the privacy of their data. So this has been although we think of cybersecurity and data privacy as being a relatively new issue, it's been one that has been really front and center for me for 40 years. In terms of what we do, I would say, there's a lot of crossover between the operational side, but really what we work on a lot is, first of all, compliance, and we'll talk a lot about compliance. We, with various laws, the numerous federal, well, there aren't any federal laws really, but there are some, but the laws in the United States, outside the United States, we also work, we get involved when there's a breach, and we help guide people through the breach. That's actually where I think Stan and I really started to collaborate on. California adopted the breach notification law back in '92. And we also work on corporate governance, which I think is also something we're going to talk about because that's a traditional area. So that's my story. That's my excuse for being here today.
Okay, well, we're glad you're here. So
never hear that about lawyers, so thank you.
Right, and we'll be careful not to make if we make lawyer jokes. The rule is they have to be good jokes.
Well, the rule is you have to speak slowly and clearly because I might not understand it otherwise. So that's the.
I hear you. I definitely hear you. Well, let's jump right in and look at it from the side of, okay, real world, on the ground. Companies get breached, they get hacked, they lose their computers, their laptops, and their cars get stolen, whatever. Information is lost, and that's a segue to you, Jason. Just you get called when bad things happen to your clients, and tell us a bit about what are the calls about? What are they doing? What are the losses that you're seeing most frequently?
We had one last week that was a social engineering spoof.
You just went to mute. There you go.
Didn't come. I'll put my hands up. It was an entertainment account that has a crime policy with an endorsement called electronic data transfer or wiring. Social engineering is the mainstream term on the street, where you're getting an email, you're wiring money for a movie script to another movie production company, and you're wiring a couple $1 million. Okay. And, Chris goes ahead and spoofs the email of the production company, and you think you're getting an email from the production company, but it's really, the bad character per se is Chris, and they spoof the email, and we get a link, and we wire the money and the wires to the bad guys, to Chris's his posse. That's how it works. So we had that last week. Mm-hmm. So they call us up, they said the production company never got it, and we had to trace everything. And then luckily they had an insurance policy, and we immediately got the incident response team in place, and but it's sure panic.
Mhm.
It is sure panic, and you know, they lost $1.5 million.
Yeah.
Luckily, they had 3 million, and they listened to us, and they had coverage, and they were able to remediate part of it and go in there. But again, the company is resistant to basically going ahead and putting the best practices in there. What's reasonable, to your point, Stan, as far as putting a proactive solution in place, because it's going to happen to everybody in this room.
Mhm.
This was last week, and it was over $1 million. So
Yeah.
that's a perfect example of what we're seeing. And we're seeing that all the time: spoofing emails, social engineering, everything else.
Mhm.
We're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a good kickoff story. that
Someone,
you're-
Michael, do they call the Secret Service? So
Yeah.
I am on the task force of the Secret Service for cyber crimes and cyber espionage with the Beverly Hills Police Department, and yes, they're involved.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see.
But again,
Yeah.
you have to be aligned with someone if you have a connection with a federal, you know, with the federal law enforcement, whether it's FBI, Secret Service, or the NSA. So luckily I am, and we were able to go ahead and get it mitigated. But if you don't, you're kind of behind the 8 ball.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a screaming message, because it's happening a lot. And we'll get into the insurance products later, I'm sure. But it's a systemic. You know, I call it the other pandemic that you can't really see. There's a pandemic going on within the cyber world, or what's going on in the environment of businesses, where you can't really see it. You kind of hear about it, a blurb, when you're watching the news at night and you're having dinner, and you kind of hear it in the background. But it is a pandemic as far as the bad characters and the exposure.
Yeah. Well, and I talked to the FBI last week, same subject, and
You talk to Mike. So
yeah, Mike's on, yeah.
Mhm.
And the number I'm now hearing is $30 million a month in losses here in the LA region
Wow.
that they know about. That's just what they know, because a lot of this stuff doesn't get reported. Let's move over, Bob, to you from the legal side. I mean, there's now a lot of laws, a lot of regulations beginning to cover the subject of what a company is expected to do to protect the information of consumers or citizens, or, you know, real people, if you will, down in, you know, that they might have in their systems. How's that shaping up?
Well, you know, first of all, there's a lot of people are sort of misreading it. There's been a lot of attention paid to California with the California Consumer Privacy Act and the CPRA. It's really an amendment to the CCPA. The Virginia and Colorado have both recently adopted new acts, but the security requirements have been around for a long time. I mean, there are 24 states which have adopted some laws which specifically relate to information security. The California, Virginia, Colorado, and others are primarily privacy laws, and they're primarily focused on the ownership and control of personal information, as opposed to the protection of information. They all have some, they all, however, do carry some potential liability if information is exfiltrated. So, for example, as has been widely reported, the CCPA is a very popular law with class action attorneys, because it allows for statutory damages if certain types of personal information have been exfiltrated, have been, you know, gone into the wild, compromised, as a result of failure to follow the law, which does require just generally that maintain reasonable security. Of course, reasonable security is the subject today. The reason that's important is because although it's not huge, it's anywhere from $150 to $750 per incident. Those can add up. And one of the problems that plaintiffs have had traditionally has been to identify and value the damages. You don't see any cases here. These are all been settlements, the numbers that you've seen. But, there's a lot of other stuff going on. The FTC is very much involved in this. FTC gets in because it looks at a breach as potentially a unfair and deceptive trade practice. By the way, every state has a similar mini FTC law. So they will come at the point of saying, well, you've told people through your privacy policies that you protect their information. And they will then say, well, if it wasn't protected, if there was a breach, maybe you were lying to people. And that's how they get their licks in. There are also some specific requirements for professions. And I don't know, there may be people like lawyers and accountants and doctors and stuff on this. And lawyers in particular, we've done a number of work. We represent a lot of law firms and accounting firms. Lawyers and accountants have specific professional requirements to maintain the security of client data. And there are specific statements, for example, by the State Bar of California on the obligation of attorneys to evaluate the security of their systems and to use appropriate practices given the nature of their business. And then I just have to mention, as we've talked about, there are a lot of, United States does not do a really good job adopting legislation. I mean, it's good for lawyers, bad for the world, but but there are a variety of different laws which are either, in fact, there are state laws, there are jurisdictional or sectional laws. For example, there is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which specifically talks about security requirements for banking institutions, financial institutions. There's HIPAA, which I think George mentioned earlier, and that goes to security requirements for healthcare organizations and other covered entities and their associates. There's the Children Online Privacy Protection Act, which relates specifically to the security of children's information. And then there are, general security requirements. A lot of plaintiffs will seek to latch on to just general requirements of bailment and safeguarding information and things like that to create a lawsuit. I will tell you that if you ever see a CCPA lawsuit, there are very few cases that have been brought solely under the CCPA. They've been brought under a variety of different laws which they latch onto, and very often the CCPA is it's the vehicle for them to get into court, and hopefully they're kind of throwing spaghetti on the wall. And I'd say the final statement here. In fact, if you're an international, you've got international laws to worry about. China just has a new law. GDPR, of course, has been around for a while, but I think the final thing I'd say on there is the result is that in terms of the legal impact of this area, and it's confusion. It's confusion because there are so many different laws, and there are so many different, and there's so many different areas that it's very difficult to approach it. Now, we do it all the time. That's what we help our clients do. But I think it goes back to the original intro that you had, Stan, that this is something that's very hard to grasp. Yeah. And it's very hard to make it simple. And I'll say one other thing, since I am the only lawyer here, so I can actually talk as much as I want. There is one thing that all these laws have in common, and that is they do not set actual standards for security. They require everyone to determine what is reasonable security for their business. And so so it all loops back to what we're talking about here today. And I think that the breakout sessions, the understanding threats, categorizing risk, and evaluating your exposure, that's going to be very interesting. That's something I'm looking forward to talking about or listening about. I'm going to mute myself now just in case I start talking again.
Robert, I have to. There's 2 points on what you said, as well as what others have said. And I think first, we hear the term best practices all the time, which really don't exist because it depends.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
So the challenge that we run into is, what does that really mean? And that then I have to then segue to the point that was made. I know that there's pending legislation in Ohio. In the House, they have a bill that they're moving along, I believe. I was going to ask you about that, where the lieutenant governor there came out and said, as a business, if you're using NIST, we're going to remove all liability if you get hacked in this state. Okay. And so I wonder about that. I was like, are we really just headed down a rabbit hole even further as each state goes through these actions, whether it's a privacy law or otherwise, where it's a huge confusion of best practices and speaking very, very, very honestly, the IT community, we need guardrails in the IT community. You can't give an engineer a fluffy objective, like you say, well, use best practices, and they're going to go, well, which one? And so I often look at the problem of what essentially is these tech people they're first responders, first and foremost, many of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they're coming into the field, solving your tech problem, fixing your computer, dealing with the cybersecurity. You think about all the first responder things that are out there, right? You can't have a police officer, one showing up with a stun gun, one showing up with a bazooka, another with a nuclear warhead. Which is the right best practice, right? And so I wonder about that from the perspective of where's that going to come from? Obviously, we have CIS, CSC, and so for the group, that's more the question for the group. And there's lots of angles. And it's just getting muddier and messier unless you're in finance, healthcare, or obviously the COPPA side of the things, but children under the age of 13. So then what's that going to look like, Robert? Do you think? Is it just going to get uglier? And then what does about best practices?
Yeah, it reminds me of, I was listening to one of my favorite cyber webcasts or podcasts. And they mentioned that you hear a lot. I know that there are people who've been involved in the military before, and they'd say, well, they have military grade security or the military grade protection. And they said, there's no such thing. It's one of those things. And best practices is the problem is best practices is what's good for you. And I've been involved in a couple of the NIST in the NIST formulations, because NIST is, there's not one NIST. There are dozens of different NIST standards for different industries. For instance, because I do a lot of work in the hospitality space, I was involved in helping evaluate their what they call their property management program, and it's pretty good. But in the end, what it really requires is that the institution identify and evaluate its level of risk. That is always where we start with clients. We have, our favorite tools is we have, and I think probably everyone here does have, I'm sure Jason has, and I think I may have cribbed partially from it, a risk assessment questionnaire. How do you determine? Well, you can't figure it out. I mean, it's really basic. What information do you collect? Where is it? Who has access to it? Really start with real basics. But in terms of things like Ohio, I've read that. My family's from Ohio, so I'm not going to say bad things about Ohio. But I'm not wild about that law because I think that is going to backfire. And I think also I'm not sure having a place where in one state all it's going to do is drive plaintiffs to other states, because you're going to look at where's the defendant. Where's the plaintiff resident? Well, California's not going to care if it's Ohio. California's going to apply the CCPA, because these are consumer protection laws. So I think that's crazy. And I think and George, I would just say in short, I think your statement, there's no place for this concept of best practices unless there is universal agreement on what best practices are. And considering that there are so many different competing standards, There isn't, there cannot be right now. You cannot say there's a best practice.
That's a good segue, I think, over to you, Chris, because you're so involved in CMMC, and CMMC, the Department of Defense initiative, is in some sense trying to characterize what best practices at a minimum has to look like. That's my sense of it.
Yeah, I think one CMMC is an evolution of NIST 800-171. To Bob's point, there's a ton of NIST publications. The one in this case that CMMC is directly mappable to and is really the baseline for CMMC is NIST 800-171. And I think I mean, just on the points of the conversations that were just being had, if you believe the diehards with CMMC, you know, this could be something that goes from the DoD to the rest of the federal government. We've already seen some of that, to state and local governments, and then, hey, maybe could this be the one standard of all? But kind of jumping back to what CMMC is. So CMMC, Bob talked a lot about information, and most of the information he was talking about was personal information, privacy information, personal health information. In this case, what CMMC is the DoD wants their contractors to protect their intellectual property. So different type of information here. It's not all of ours on this webcast or those watching's information. It's, you know, the DoD high target of interest, obviously, in the world. The logic behind this is, hey, if you look at the F-35, which was a plane that took us a decade to develop, and then it was the new technology, and like a week after we came out with it, China came out with it, and so the logic behind CMMC is it's a financial one, it's a national security one, but it's protecting two types of information, and really both are intellectual property of the Department of Defense in this case. One is called controlled unclassified information that the government labels and flows down to their contractors. The other is what's called federal contract information, which is information that's gleaned in the government contracting process, but is not public information. And I think to take it back to reasonableness, so that the big difference between CMMC and its predecessor, which was NIST 800-171, is two things. Number one is a nod to reasonableness and an admission, I think, that when the government, or when the DoD at least, started enforcing via contractual clauses the NIST 800-171 requirement, which has 110 security controls, and then they did an inspection of it. The Inspector General came and looked at all the defense contractors and basically realized that this isn't improving our cybersecurity posture at all. One of the things that they kind of admitted is, from a reasonableness standard, it wasn't reasonable to hold everybody to that same standard. The example I always give is a gardener on Camp Pendleton, right down the street, they don't have the same type of information and should not have the same kind of security controls as somebody working on a nuclear weapon system, right? And so what CMMC did, which is a departure from NIST, is they said, okay, we're going to break this into 5 levels, and these levels are nested. So level 1 is only 17 security controls. It's a basic kind of cyber hygiene, if you will. And then, level 2, level 3 is where you start to deal with controlled unclassified information, 4 and 5. And so if you're a level 3, that means you're also a level 2 and a level 1. And so I think that is definitely a nod to reasonableness. And then the second thing that CMMC did, which we'll see if this becomes a kind of the way forward, is similar to kind of the financial world. They're now actually going to require an independent third-party assessment of are you meeting the security controls? And so, our company, for example, we're heavy in this space, and so we're an approved certified third-party assessing organization. So we'll come into a company and we will assess them, and we'll say, hey, you're at a level 1, you're at a level 4. And what the DoD's ultimately said is, hey, we're going to put out levels in our contracts, and if it's a level 3 requirement and you only assess to a level 2 or level 1, I'm sorry, you can't bid on that. And so I think that inspection piece is the second one, as opposed to a lot of these standards are more self-reporting, self-assessment. Now there's actually a stick where somebody's going to come in and assess you where you're at, and there's a business risk there. Back to the conversation of can this become the standard for everything? The the one thing that the DoD and we've seen this creep up in the federal government is probably going to go to other contractors, but they ultimately pay the bill, so they can do this, right? It's going to cost the companies more to get this reasonable security. When you start to extrapolate that to the civilian and commercial world, that's a different story.
Yeah. And that's a good point. I guess the distinction between what kind of information are we expected to reasonably protect? Because Barry, you're in a very broad commercial space, very much like our company is as well. So you're looking at privacy across a number of different domains, different sets of regulations, different sets of standards, and so on. How do you see all this stuff let
me tell you a little bit about my personal trajectory through this discussion over time.
Yeah.
Years ago, focused a lot on this question of reasonable, and reasonable in my mind, as Bob pointed out, and Chris has pointed out, is fundamentally based upon, are you following an appropriate set of practices? Are you following a life cycle of management? Are you doing things in a way that balances the impact to others and the impact to yourself? And it's not at a high level, it's not that complicated to deal with the word reasonable, even across multiple laws. So I started there and came to that aha. Then I realized I've lived so many years in what's practical. I own this inside of organizations. I've owned this. And the question becomes, how do you translate that into what's practical for an organization? And then I started reaching out to really smart attorneys like Bob and others like him that understand this space of what the laws say, because our organization cannot divorce ourselves from the laws. There's so many of them, as Bob pointed out. And they keep changing. I mean, I'm reading yesterday about the UK GDPR, and like how that's diverging from EU GDPR.
Yeah.
It never stops changing. And then I started realizing, and this is the question I started asking all these smart attorneys that we associate with. It's one thing to say we're compliant, and we're following all the appropriate steps to be compliant. It's another thing to say we're doing a reasonable job at being compliant. And then I reached the aha question. The aha question was, is it okay to simply implement a defensible position? So this is not guaranteeing you're compliant, but at least you can define a defensible position from enforcement. And that defensible position from enforcement is ultimately reasonable to organizations, because that's the real threat. It's, are you going to be, are the litigation attorneys trying to come after you? Is the FTC trying to come after you? Are the state's attorney generals trying to come after you? Is the, one of the ICOs or national regulators from the EU trying to come after you? It really comes down to, have you built a defensible position where you can say, I'm doing what I need to do. No one is ever going to be perfect at this, but I've got a defensible position to say, I'm on that path. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. And every single time, and it shocked me, the first time I was very nervous about asking this question to one of these really intelligent and experienced attorneys, is it okay to do that? And the answer was, every single time I asked one of them, the answer was yes.
Yeah.
So ultimately, we start with that position in the pure operational implementation. Yes, you have to be compliant. Yes, it absolutely makes sense to be reasonable, and there's ways to measure reasonableness. But ultimately, it's defensible that you need to get to, because that is what ultimately protects you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I share that perspective, as you know, because we've had many discussions offline around that same subject, and again, right back to you. We started with you, Jason. It goes back to you because when you're, when you've got an insurance policy, part of that policy, I would, in some cases, would include in it legal support should you be sued, right? And given that, the insurance companies aren't going to want to sell you a policy that they're going to defend you unless they know that part of what you're doing falls into that which might be called defensible. How's all that playing out in your space?
Well, getting back to what the other panelists were discussing, it's the wild, wild west right now. Everybody's doing something. You just don't know what it is until you do. And then when you do know what it is, it might be too late.
Yeah.
To George's, when George and I have collaborated together, some people are just resistant on going ahead and biting the bullet and being compliant. The insurance market now, and we'll go, if you want to take a deeper dive later this morning, the insurance market is out of control. To answer your specific question, Stan, you need to have X, Y, and Z and A, B, C and all the letter of the alphabet to get an insurance policy right now. Depending on what sector of business that you're in, if you don't go and comply with them, they're going to tell you have a great day and a better tomorrow.
Yeah.
And they're doing it right now. If you're an MSP or you're in IT or you're carrying a lot of PII and you don't have MFA to begin with, they're not even going to talk to you.
Yeah.
They're just not.
Yeah.
And these policyholders are befuddled because they don't understand. Well, last year I didn't have it. So why do I have to have it this year? So they got their head in the sand and it's like 6 feet under, like that TV show on HBO, if everybody remembers that. They don't get it. And it's, and then it's our fault and then it's the carrier's fault. But yes, you do have to have a lot of things in place right today. And then tomorrow it's going to be different.
Yeah.
If you don't have anything.
This makes me think of the reality that I think sometimes I struggle with the insurers because it seems like every different, it seems like there is some articles that are floating to the top saying, hey, what do underwriters want to see? Right. But it doesn't always apply depending upon what your industry is. Right. So again, best practices, standards, no one really knows where it's going.
No, there's not. When I say best practices, I take what the insurance company is giving them and I'm saying, put this and implement it now.
Yeah. People trust that concept of insurance. It's been around for a long time. It's a proven industry. Right. So why wouldn't you listen to them? But at the same time, I keep coming back to this issue of the miss that I see is that we've been looking at hackers the wrong way for a long time. We see them as, criminals with their guns, their digital guns blazing. And I've said this more recently is that hackers, yes, they're criminals, they're bad guys, but they're also arsonists. Right? They set these little digital fires inside of your network, right? And so if you see an incident happen today, police show up, fire show up, right? In the real world. So I think that's the missing link is that, we have what essentially is inspectors of buildings for fires, right? So in the insurance company, I think that's what they're trying to do is they're trying to give the list of, well, we're your fire inspector, your sprinkler isn't installed, your digital sprinkler isn't installed. So go use MFA as that digital sprinkler, just using the analogy to make it simple for people that are trying to understand.
No, I get it.
So that, and so that seems to be a big challenge is finding that baseline. And I agree, Jason, I think insurers they're in for a continuing wild ride. I think it's already been a wild ride for them.
Well, it's funny. Before, I would say well, way before the pandemic, probably in the middle of 2019, you had about 250 carriers tripping over their own feet to write this stuff, and they were giving the policies away. I remember going on a panel discussion when we were all meeting in person with CLM, that's claim litigation management, that organization, and we were talking about it. And Rick Bortnick, who you guys met yesterday from Wilson Elser, was telling them they're giving these policies away, and they were $9.99 a pound, and you didn't have to put anything in place to go ahead and get them. And then when these insurers come back to you and say, oh, well, you know, well, a couple years ago, no, stop. You cannot go back to a couple years ago, because I go back, how much is a gallon of milk right now versus 2019? It's over. You can't go back in time. This is the reality. If not, you're going to be compromised, and it's going to happen. So, you know, you can scare them all you want, but, you know, I have my CYA letter, if you know what that is. And if they don't want to comply and they don't want to do that, here's a letter signing off. So when you do get breached, you can't come back to me, because I got my little letter right here. That's my get out of jail free card. So it's systemic. And then you get their IT people involved. Some of them are okay. Some of them are kind of, it's an ego trip, because you're telling them I got to do this. Well, they're fine. They don't need anything. No, they're not fine. So you're fighting with the IT people because the business owner doesn't have time for it. So it's systemic. I call it another pandemic.
You know, I don't know that it's the business owner doesn't have time for it, right? And let's be honest.
Well, it's not a priority.
It's not just that. This is what I've learned, is that there's tons of CEOs out there that are doing their best, and when things get messy in marketing, they jump in. When things are getting messy in finance, they jump in and they help. They get messy in any other department, and they know it. These departments have been around for years. But anything with a blinking light, there's a lot of them out there that go, it's got a blinking light. IT, give it to IT, and they just kind of close their eyes. But now they have to start leading it. They can lead all these other departments. So I think that's the origin of the problem, is that, and I think the IT people, and you know, I have to defend them to some degree, because they're always told, I pay you the big bucks, go use best practices. And they're like, what does that mean, right? So I think there's part of it is that the IT workers, as first responders, they don't know what tools that, you know, they've gone to the boss before and said, you need no budget, right? Yeah. And so I think to some degree, there's some of that going on, but then you just have immaturity in IT as well. I'm not discounting that doesn't happen, Jason.
No, it's a combination of everything. I mean, it always takes two to tango. I mean, I have a client that is in telecommunications, and they're repackaging third-party long distance calls for, long distance packages for AT&T or T-Mobile.
Right.
And they go ahead and say, you know, they don't have MFA. And they needed higher limits to do a contract. All right. And I said to them, I said, you're going to get non-renewed.
Yeah.
You just are. And I mean, put me in touch with your IT person, and I'll go talk to them, because I have to bypass them because they're resistant to me. So I'm like, I'm here to help you, and you have to help me help you. So if you're not going to help me, then if you don't want to give me to your IT person, you're going to get non-renewed because you don't want to do all this stuff. So it's an ego thing. It's also like, it's not me. Nothing can happen to me. Oh, I don't have anybody's sensitive information. It's not about that anymore. It's not like 2005 where you were given credit cards and you were taking the credit card numbers, and you would get breached and they would get the credit card numbers. We're beyond that. That's the Stone Ages.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what people are realizing, I think, you know, there's been a lot of talk, and I mentioned about the privacy of personal information. The real risk we see is enterprise, is the enterprise itself, because the big money is not in credit card numbers. I mean, that no one cares.
No, that was 2005. They go back to 2005, Bob, and they think, oh, well, I'm not taking credit cards. I don't have
right. But the real issue is someone going to get it. Is someone going to get into your system and shut you down? Is someone going to get the system where, and then, you know, I guess we'll talk about some of the ransomware issues later on, but is someone going to get to the point where you can't do business? That's the risk. That for most institutions, they shouldn't. Compliance is one thing, you can get sued by people, but if you don't have adequate, and this kind of goes to Barry's point, well, I'm going to actually, it's not, because I understand what Barry's saying. Yeah, I tell a lot of people, you have to worry about operational security, because if you cannot secure the value of your enterprise, what are you doing in business? If you can't lock the door when you leave the office, what's the point? You know, it's not, you know, it's there's a lot of things to worry about, but I mean, we have clients who've gone out of business, straight out of business after an attack.
Mhm.
Of course.
You know,
Yeah.
and no one, and you know, and then they have to report it. You know, it's great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think-
you know, and human beings are human beings. They're gonna click everything in sight. They're gonna see
Yeah.
something and they're gonna click and they're gonna push and they're gonna click again. And you know, certain generations, you know, like my parents' generations, they got duped the other day, or they almost got duped, and I had to intervene. Okay,
Yeah.
they got phone calls and they wanted information from them, and it's happening. And those, you know, that's the demographics that if they're not aware of what's going on, they're gonna be a victim. Period.
Yeah, I mean, one of the people I didn't talk about earlier is the SEC has gotten increasingly involved in requiring companies to disclose their risk profile. And it's because it's an investor issue.
Mhm.
It's not a question of are they protecting personal information of employees or customers? It's a question of whether they are at risk, whether they have an enterprise risk because of their security practices.
Yeah, that's a good segue. This whole discussion towards the first piece of, you know, let's have a broader, a focused discussion, if you will, around threats and our organization, what the specifics for an organization compliance requirements have to look like. And I hope everybody's been following the chat log as well. There's Charles Fleming, Cheryl Washington, Barry's been involved, but do that. Here's, again, I'm posting the link so you can get to it. If you go to that page and click the button that says computing your summary information or security risk profile, I want to take you through a way of kind of thinking about this as the starting point. What threats are you under reasonably? What threats are you reasonably under? Again, like the word reasonable, you know, shows up. And then from that as well, what are your legal obligations? Because that, in some sense, that's where this stuff starts. So if, for example, threat of attack, I wrote down on this, we wrote down on this sheet, and you can print this out and fill it out. That's the intent, is that this not be just something that, oh gee, it's nice for the webinar, but it's in fact something you can use back in the office, if you will, at getting your arms around what you've got to do. So the first piece is, well, what threats are we reasonably subject to? And I've said, you know, I think every company, and please push back the panel, can reasonably expect business email compromise. Jason, that was your first piece of the discussion. Companies that are losing money because they're wiring it to the wrong place. And we've seen $1 million, you know, wiring mistakes that way. And we've seen $50,000 ones as well, but it's real money.
Yeah, and those are all crimes.
That's right. They're all crimes.
They're all crimes.
Ransomware is another. And then you look at, you know, and I've got a list. I don't pretend it's complete, but cyber extortion. They get your information and they threaten to post it online on the Wall Street Journal. You know, I remember it was a while ago, a law firm in New York with a lot of A-list clients, including Madonna and others, got breached. And the cyber criminals asked for some $30 million, $40 million, I think, or they would release that information. There's the theft of personally identifiable information, PII, and again, looking, Bob, at you, exactly what is PII is still an open question, I think, right?
It's pretty much
Well,
everything.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we tend to look at it. We stopped we stopped making differentiators. If you can use it in some way to identify someone, it's PII.
Yeah.
And the thing is that people don't recognize the scope of what PII can be. But if you can, and that, so it's going to include things like your your MAC addresses, and it's going to include if a company gives a customer a number, it's going to include that number. But the real question you have to understand is, well, why do I want to know? What's the purpose of identifying something as PII? The reason for doing that is because it's going to trigger certain legal requirements. So, for example, you see in California, we have one set of personal information which is directly related to data breaches, to notifying victims and potentially the government of data breaches. We have another definition of PII for the purposes of controlling information under the CCPA. And we have another definition within the CCPA for determining liability for a breach, for what I mentioned before, the statutory damages. So, I tend to look and say, I don't really care. If it's something that can identify someone, because you have to go to the lowest common denominator. So I said, I'm not, it's interesting because I think what I really like about this risk review is that it really goes to, again, what I think is the clearer issue, which is PII gets disclosed, it's embarrassing, it can cost you money. But the things we're talking about here are really things that will impact an organization, small, medium, or large. And where you really, and that to me is that there's not enough attention being paid to that by companies, because that's an existential threat to the company. I mean, I had a call from someone the other day. I think I may have handed them off to you guys, to you, Stan. I don't know if they ever called back, about someone who had who somebody got into a system and they just played around the system and stole money. To say it's a crime, but thieves are with us, and people like they do that. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough, And so again, I think in this funny way, despite the fact that it's sort of getting to be more and more my specialty, the focus on personal information is not as important as I mean, if your personal information is exfiltrated, that's an indication of a weakness in your system. But you have to go to the other end of this. Well, what else has been done? More and more, what we're saying is that is multi-purpose attacks. So people get in. I mean, I don't know. I guess we're not going to talk about it, but the ecosystem of malware is a really interesting business. I mean, it's constantly changing, but it's gotten to the point where there are experts in infiltration, and then they get in and they basically sell the ability to use their foothold for someone who may want to look around for personal information, for company information, to get and people who will go. There's a whole other group of people simply, once you get in, all they'll do is see how they can get more credentials and get further into the system, and others will buy the right to be able to look at it and identify specific types of information and that they're interested and others might not be. So I think that the security issue has to be looked at a very high level because of its potential of the existential threat.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And this is part of this stuff is not simple, that you've got to be able to look at it at a high level. And that's what these threats of attacks are intended to be. But you've also got to be able to look at it really down deep into the details, because yes, if a bad guy gets into your system and sells that access to somebody else who can now go into your system and do all kinds of bad things, the threat has just expanded and exploded. like, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on all of the individual details here. You can look at them. I would say if you don't know if it's expected or unexpected, that's a time to call one of us in, and let's help clarify that based on what kind of business you're in some sense. I mean, I looked at the theft of IP, and I immediately think of people like you, Chris, that the IP you're trying to protect could be very sensitive, unclassified in a CUI, basically, that it's IP that could lead to somebody else, the enemy, being able to build the equivalent of the F-35 because they've stolen the IP from you. That kind of thing, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that gets to the point that I think Bob was kind of making too, is this is about this first step on this sheet is really kind of your threat profile is how what we think of it, right? And so yes, there's the PII threat and the data and there's financial gain, but there's also the threat of, and you have it on here, right? Would a nation state actor be interested in you? Would a competitor be interested in you? There's another type of information that we've kind of hinted at, but we haven't really called it out, that we kind of focus on what we call like technical gateway information, right? So are you a gateway company to a lot of other companies, right? Us on our managed services arm, for sure, right? You attack one company and now all of a sudden you can get into a lot of companies. And so those different types of information and that threat profile is really what you're doing here at the beginning. And that's an important starting point in terms of, are you more of a target of opportunity, we kind of think about it, or are you a target of interest? Are you going to get caught up in a bigger breach where they're targeting a bunch in your industry or something, or are you going to be targeted yourself because you're for good reason, or you piss somebody off, or you just have a lot of data?
Yeah.
The SolarWinds attack wasn't about attacking SolarWinds.
Yeah, no, and there've been a lot of those, and it makes. Yeah. I got to tell you, these guys who are doing it are not stupid.
Yeah,
they have got great business models, and so I mean, I keep thinking I got on the wrong end of this business.
But from an attack perspective, I personally love what the evolution of what's going on with the Center of Internet Security, CIS, where they're now at the community defense model version 2, where they're saying we're going to define a set of controls that specifically help you deal with the most common 5 attack types, which include malware, ransomware, web application hacking, insider privilege and misuse, and targeted intrusions. So they're saying it absolutely makes sense to start with, let's understand what it is we need to protect. Let's understand why somebody might want to attack us. Totally makes sense, because you need to understand how to protect it. You can't protect something unless you know what you're protecting. Yeah. But then the question is, okay, but oh, by the way, this is the attack types that are coming at you. And if you deal with these kinds of attacks and you focus on those things you're trying to protect, then you've got a method of approaching this in a reasonable way and from a legal perspective, a defensible way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I purposely wrote a couple of, and again, these are not intended to be all the types of attack threats that to be under. As you can see, some of them deal with the threat is of something that can happen, and the others deal with the threat of somebody who wants to make something happen, the nation state or a political enemy or whatever. And well, so much of the discussion deals with like ransomware. We're going to shut down your systems by encrypting them, or business email compromise. Then there's the whole denial of service thing. If I can block your website from acting, from serving customers, and that also, if depending on who you're about, that can be expected or not expected. But it's certainly something you have to think about, that whole denial of service as an issue here, right, George? Yeah.
Well, I often come back to the same kind of guiding principle, which is, you have everyone has to plan, right? You just have to plan now. You can't react. I don't think anyone disagrees, and that always starts, at least these days, with either an SRA or security risk assessment. But it darn well better include a regulatory impact assessment as well, as things get uglier. Which I'll yield to you, Robert, on that one, whether or not you think that the legal impact assessments are something that organizations of certain size, what are the attributes of an organization that should be checking their exposures, whether it be privacy laws or regulations or those sorts of things. Because I just think there's a lot of medium-sized businesses out there that have no idea what their exposure is until the wheels fall off the bus and the hacker crashes into the network.
Yeah, the only thing I disagree with what you said is that people are aware that they have to do it.
Touche.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, there's no question. I think it's interesting. I think that you mentioned before, somebody sees a blinking light and suddenly they stop and they don't know what to do. Fact is, this is a core competency of just about every business, which is to understand what they do and what risks they face. And it's interesting, and it's interesting that this is one area where businesses leave it entirely to people who are not conversant in their business. Right. So I joke that most of my clients end up being pretty good lawyers for their business. They understand they end up understanding what laws apply and what goes into contracts. And, we try to write things in English. I know you guys don't believe it, but we really do. Really try to write things in English. And they get very good. They say, and in a lot of areas, they know more. I mean, they know more about their business than I do. They live in their business and don't do it. But when it comes to computers, when it comes to their systems, they completely leave that to people who make decisions without understanding, without getting the benefit of really understanding what it does to a company's risk profile, not just the security risk profile, but the entire business risk profile. And I think that's one of, when I think Jason, you said, that, or, we need these tools. I said, well, it's not in the budget. That's because people, and I second what you're saying. They say, well, we can't do it because it's on the budget, and said, but it's just as important as every other part of the budget.
Yeah.
And the companies have not integrated the data security into their DNA, and realized that for almost every company, it has to be a core competency.
Yeah.
Well, and this came up before, but just to follow up on that, I think we also need to differentiate that the security skill set is one that is, we're building more well-rounded IT professionals that have security, but for the longest time, it was the government and the military, and then the Fortune 500 companies that it was credit card data, right? That's what we cared about. And so you can't just flick a switch. And I know that there's a lot of material out there, but overnight and have a bench of security professionals, right? All of us on this call have a difficulty hiring right now. And a lot of times we're looking for unicorns because there's just not as many as you would like. And so you mentioned a core competency. Yes, everybody's almost like a tech company now, but we still don't have that bench. And it's being addressed of security professionals to actually do what needs to be done.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I will tell you that one of the scariest things that we hear when there's a data breach, and we come in and we say, okay, well, we want to engage so and so. Because this is business, we have a whole bench of people who do these things, whether they're big companies, small. And they say, no, my IT guy's going to take care of it. And I said, yeah, great, no problem. How many logs has he already erased?
Yeah.
So, what did you do? Oh, we turned off the computer. Oh, thank you. That's nice.
Yeah. And that's such a major problem in the field. I mean, as you point out, Chris, we're right now short some hundreds of thousands of security professionals at the nation level. And I don't remember the exact number, but it's big. And, that's one of the initiatives we have at Secure the Village is to help help the nation, if you will, get past this problem. I want to stay on kind of this first the discussion point and move over to the list of legal obligations that's on the worksheet that we put together. And again, I don't pretend that this is complete, but I do suggest it's, it's a start. Look at your own business out there, or if you're consultants on the call, look at the businesses of the companies that to which you consult, whether it's IT consulting or management consulting or legal or what IT, whatever it might happen to be. But are you in a situation where you've got to notify customers in the event of a breach? And that's going to be I think an automatic yes for most businesses. I'll leave it to you, Bob, to parse that most out appropriately. Same thing, you have to notify the SEC. You had mentioned the SEC earlier. If you're publicly traded, I know the answer to that is yes. If you're, I don't know, if you're private but big enough or something, you still may have SEC responsibilities. Again, that becomes a legal question. I don't know that answer, but I know who to call should I need to get that answer. And again, that's the way you should look at this forum. If you're part of, one of the attendees, just you need to get this answer appropriately, because that'll help you sort out what in your organization is or is not reasonable. Same thing. Are you subject to HIPAA? Are you subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley? Are you subject to the FTC safeguards rules? And that goes kind of wide ranging, because according to the IRS, an accounting firm that does tax returns is subject to the FTC safeguards rule. So they got to do that. It's more explicit, I think, easier to determine if you're subject to the payment card industry data security standards. Do you take credit cards, or do you at least take them online? The California Consumer Privacy Act. We've got 3 webinars. Bob's a panelist on one of them, just on CCPA that we did back just before CCPA went into the law. And then there's all the other state privacy laws, and those are a moving target. Again, I mean, this is why, and you'll see this on the very bottom of this form when we talk about things you should be doing. You need to have your attorney at least once a year just sit down with you and look at your business and say, yes, we're subject to this laws, and no, we don't have to do this, and so on. And that includes GDPR. One of the side effects of Britain leaving the EU is now we're going to get a separate set of GDPR-like laws for the United Kingdom. We have a client that's looking to open up an office in London, and all of a sudden their security obligations have gone from this to this. So it's like that's part of what you got to pay attention to. And then I think, and it's a harder question for businesses, but again, it comes down to, Barry, you're talking about defensibleness, and Bob, you're the attorneys in this. How at risk are you that if there's a breach or some other security incident that you're going to get sued? Because if that's a high probability, you absolutely positively want to be defensible. But if that's a low probability, you may choose to, take that cost of becoming defensible and say, well, that's a low risk. I'll put that money into my sales department.
The challenge of that approach, Stan, is that when you look at the vectors of enforcement, right? Yes. There's a couple of different vectors that control, that drive the defensible position, right? One is that there's the question of what laws are you subject to? There's just the pure legal standpoint. Second is that most any organization that is of any size whatsoever has customers that have obligations to various compliance requirements, and they have a flow down requirement, whether it's HIPAA or whether it's GDPR or whether it's CCPA. There's a flow down requirement where they impose requirements on you to be compliant because they're required to do that.
Yeah.
And you can potentially lose their business if you're not. Right. So that those vectors, and now the insurance companies saying, oh, by the way, we're going to vote on whether or not we're going to insure you. Right. These are all vectors that control what organizations have to do. And personally, I think we're all in the business of in some respect, even personally viewing that protecting organizations is important. Every one of us believes that. Right. Yeah. But what actually motivates behavior are all these three parties. In one respect, I understand, companies may not like the fact that insurance companies may not cover them in the future. I personally think it's a good thing. It's just, you have to do things. Yeah. And if it's a threat of losing your insurance, or if it's a threat of losing a customer, or if it's a threat coming from, an attorney general, this is helping you think the right way, whether you like it or not. Yeah. And they're just not bad things for organizations.
Yeah.
Well, and Barry, this came up in our pre-conference, but I think that gets back to the point that we were talking about earlier, that there's a maturity of this industry right now as well, right? And the maturity, and this came up in our pre-talk, is start, right? Just start. And what we're trying to do, what all these compliance standards are trying to do, is get people to start building a security and compliance program that is a living, breathing thing that will iterate over time as risks change, as they get more capability. And that's the maturity. That's where we're at in terms of this industry and the stage and the lack of talent, all that. It's start is reasonable, right? And then build on that.
And start is defensible.
And however we get people to start, whether it's you can't get insurance or the government's telling you to do it or a larger partner, that's where we're at, and that's the important thing right now.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's finding growing into evolving the management structure in your organization so that you can truthfully say, we take cybersecurity every bit as seriously as we take operations and finance. We have processes, we have procedures, we have rules, we have norms of behavior that may not be written down, but everybody knows to follow them because that's the culture of the organization. So we know how to manage our finance. We know how to manage operations. We know how to manage the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to do that same thing in cybersecurity. And that goes to this whole discussion, the next section of the next piece of this section of the discussion around just laying out and documenting what are your competitive requirements. Are you covered by CMMC? Yes or no? And if you don't know, again, go find out. And if you're a defense contractor, the answer is yes. Yeah. Are you required to comply with practices set by your customers and your clients? I mean, in HIPAA, there's the business associates agreements kinds of things. We have a lot of clients, again, in law and accounting, that their customers, who often are banks, are pushing requirements down to them, or their customers who are larger companies with their own compliance requirements, not just banks, but other kinds of organizations as well, pushing down. How likely are you to lose customers if you have a breach? In some industries with some kinds of customers, you may have enough of a lock-in that that's not going to affect your business. And in others, you can have all of your customers running off to competitors that way. Again, you need to kind of begin to think through this, because that's what guides you to reasonableness. And a whole other piece of this, and we're seeing this, we've talked about it over the years, and we're seeing it. If your competitors have a breach, we don't want bad things to happen to people in general. The world breaches happen. And if they happen to your competitors, are you in a position to pick up the opportunity, the competitive opportunity from that happening? Becomes a whole other thing to think about when you're thinking about the reasonableness of your own program. How do you tie it into your marketing and sales efforts? So let's, take advantage of it if you can, right? Becomes another area.
Wait. Are you suggesting that we should advise people to profit off of other people's misery? Because that's my business. That's my business model. I'm just checking.
In that respect, I keep wondering about all these car rental companies who have no inventory any longer because they sold it all off and none of them thought that everyone was doing that. And there was going to be no capacity in 2021. You ought to plan for the marketing opportunity for that.
Yeah.
Well, people run in herds. I think that's one thing.
Mm.
I wanted to say one thing. You mentioned something interesting, Stan, about considering, are you going to lose clients? I think every study that I've read indicates that any kind of breach with a profile, that the largest cost, although it's very hard to determine, is the loss of clients and customers and loss of public trust. And so I would just say that, it's a question, it's sort of like backups. One of the key elements to any kind of security profile is to have a backup, is to have 3 backups, have one of them air gap, make sure your backup isn't in the hard drive right next to your server, that kind of thing. And we always say, oh, great. And they say, well, we've got a backup. It's great. Have you tried it yet? Have you done it? Well, I think when you think about that's one of the challenges is in a data breach. Is not, are you going to lose clients, but how do you regain their trust? How do you regain them? Because you will lose them.
Yeah.
You will lose clients and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I just,
I
couldn't help I'm the only lawyer. I get to say anything I want.
No, but that's an absolutely right point, because it's also, just a natural segue over to you, Jason, that there are certain things, you can provide dollar compensation for losses that are, documented and quantified and all of that. That's clearly in a policy. But how do you can't ensure that loss of customer trust. Once that's gone, how much money, how can I insure against that, is because the question, Jason, how do I transfer that risk?
These policies are comprehensive. They cover a lot: reputation, crisis management, business interruption. If they cover a lot. I say a lot of people are running around with something that they think is good. When I say something like an insurance policy, like, oh, I have a standard general liability policy, and in the insurance jargon, it's a policy that is small for smaller to medium-sized businesses. It's called a BOP. It's a business owner package. So it's property and general liability rolled up into a nice burrito. That's what I call it. So you take the burrito and they say, oh, we'll put an endorsement on there. And the endorsement is data privacy coverage. And it's a Band-Aid. And they think they run around with it. And I'm like, well, not only do you not have cybercrime coverage, you don't have any regulatory. I think, Bob, you were talking about the SEC and the regulatory fines that were going on for breaches and not being compliant with the CCPA. Huge. Yep. But they think they've got it. And then the reputation of a company is massive. I mean, if you don't have coverage or you don't have anything to protect your clients, what is that to say about, what happens to you if you get breached? How are you going to go ahead and keep that business going? And I spoke years ago at the Beverly Hills Bar Association with Rick Bortnick, and we were talking about the assembly bills in the state of California with attorneys. And Bob, you probably know about this, where there's an ethical obligation for law firms or lawyers in the state of California to go ahead and provide or talk about coverage to their clients, and as well as law firms to go ahead and get coverage. And I think I can dig up the assembly bills.
No, yeah, no, it's out there.
It's out
Yeah.
there. So yeah, so I mean, that's a huge thing. And that's the reputation, because if you get breached, you've got to notify them, and it's all about the reputation, Stan. So, but Bob knows what I'm talking about.
For lawyers, I do.
Yeah, I mean, he knows
They
exactly
don't like
what I'm talking about.
lawyers are my worst clients. They don't almost
Yeah,
as
I
bad as
mean,
doctors.
they're challenging too.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting when you say them, the competitive requirements that stand that, that I think every company, as they think about it, will realize how many different constituencies they have to think about.
Yeah, that's right. And also, because doing, again, this is the final section of the final piece of this section, all the size and complexity issues. How many employees do you have? I mean, to a certain extent, the complexity of cybersecurity increases with size. And it doesn't just increase linearly, it increases in some sense exponentially. The more
100%.
people you have, the harder it is to manage this. I mean, Bank of America spends what, $1 billion a year, they say, on just on cybersecurity. I mean, that's a lot of money by any standards. How many office locations? I mean, the more locations you have, the harder it is to both to manage the IT, but also to generate the culture of security. And the same thing with staff working remotely makes that harder the more staff you have remote. And now with COVID, and people in many industries not going back to the offices, that just raises the complexity of all of this. Certainly having your IT outsourced, which so many companies in the SMB world have, makes the process harder, because again, you're outside. And Barry, you just sort of shrugged your shoulders. You're right. Maybe it doesn't if you've got the right MSP, but it can.
I would just take a different view of that. The challenge is that organizations can't do all this themselves. And as an IT leader, right, I absolutely took the stance that there's a certain amount that the IT organization can do, and then it makes sense to outsource to George and to outsource to Chris and to outsource, it's like, because they're experts at this. So it all depends. You have to find good resources, but it makes sense to outsource.
Yeah. And I'll also add to that, because this goes back to the myth that we've already talked about. When you're talking about IT, you're not talking about information security.
Right, but even
There's
IT is the same thing. It's like I've always been a proponent. I've been in the last 20 years of learn how to manage, learn how to select, learn how to manage resources, even if they're outsourced outside the organization. And in a lot of cases, you can't own all the IT resources you could ever want either.
Yeah. And I've seen that at the same time over the years, going back to the big thrust in the early 90s as big companies were outsourcing IT when that happened. And then I've seen it as well, watching companies outsource parts of their logistics and supply chain, certainly 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And in both cases, and in all those cases, you need a core competence inside, working on your side to make sure that all that stuff that you just outsourced works right. That competence, management competence, leadership competence needs to be there. And then another piece as well, just think about what percentage of your work is done by contractors, subcontractors, because that again puts pressure on the challenges of security. We're just about done with this section. We're going to take a break, but any final thoughts on this? And then what we're going to do, the next section of this is get into how do you calibrate your risk tolerance? How do you think about getting quantitative around all of this stuff to the extent that one can get quantitative? I mean, I'm a mathematician by training, and yet I recognize that the hardest thing is to get some of this stuff under quantitative control. So before we get there, before we take a break, final thoughts on this stuff? Anybody want to jump in?
I've got one on the last. So I think of this last section as really attack surface, and we kind of hit most of this, but places, people, things, even the IoT devices that are on your network, that kind of, that's part of your attack surface. But to expand on the third parties, it's in the world of the cloud, it's also CSPs. We call them CSPs, not just MSPs, right? So the cloud service providers, you know, Microsoft just had a massive Exchange breach, right? Even if you're on Office 365, okay, are they patching the servers? What, you know, they have their physical data centers. Are they preventing people from coming in? And we're seeing more and more importance coming on this, where I think people, MSPs, I think you kind of get it because it's another probably small or mid-sized business, and you're kind of on the same level as them. But even these cloud service providers are not all equal and on the same levels, and you are inheriting, taking it back to risk, you're inheriting the risk that they bring. And so, you know, I think there's a lot more focus on that, and that is definitely, don't just think because they're a big company, you know, you check the box, and they
Yeah,
do.
I would say you're right. It's the idea. I think what we've learned through the recent spate of supply chain breaches is that the concept of zero trust is well taken.
Yes.
You have to, you know, with no matter who it is, you somehow have to start. If they're in your supply chain, you have to analyze the risk that you are assuming by dealing with them.
Yeah, that's a good point. That whole zero trust. Yeah, in the old days, you know, the idea was you had a hard perimeter that kept the bad guys out, and we called it the M&M strategy, because it was, even then we understood it wasn't a very good strategy. It was just a quote common strategy: hard on the outside, soft on the inside. So once somebody got in, if they were in your network, you assumed they were legitimate, they were okay. We're learning that isn't the case now, and that takes us to zero trust. Okay, this has been great. We're going to take a little break now. We're going to take 5 minutes. Then we'll come back. I'm going to pause the recording. And then when we come back, we'll look at, you know, how do you calibrate your risk tolerance now with all of this? How do you put all some of these pieces together to figure out just how much risk can you absorb appropriately? How much risk can you take? What's that look like? And that's a whole second piece of this discussion. So let's take a break now, and we'll see you all back in 5 minutes. Great, thank you. So welcome back, everybody, to section 2, where we're going to talk about finding your risk tolerance. You know, what's right for you, and it's different for every organization. We've already had a discussion that, if I might use, Barry, your word as a general context, what's defensible, you know, for you? And in part, that's, you know, what makes sense. But here we want to get somewhat a little more quantitative as well, because risk as a qualitative term is we kind of get an intuitive sense of that. You know, when you're about to cross the street, you look both ways because there's risk in not doing that. But risk can also be made quantitative. And in part, that's what the insurance companies do. But that's also in part what, as we're learning as an industry to get our hands around reasonableness, defensibility, and questions like that, we have to start looking at the quantitative aspects of risk. And yet, at the same time, it ultimately boils down to, you know, how much risk can you take and still sleep at night? And, you know, how much security do you need to be able to do that? Barry, you want to lead off this discussion?
I'd be happy to, but I'd also want to throw out a couple of views that I don't know how to deal with, rationalize appropriately. I think that I absolutely believe, and I love quantitative analysis associated with risk. I think that makes total sense. The challenge that that we have in the privacy space is that risk isn't only about risk to the organization. You know, if you look at, you mentioned later on at the Sedona conference and what they did with respect to the definition of reasonable security, that they're saying that reasonable security is about not only protecting yourself, not only being reasonable to yourself with respect to the cost of safeguards and so forth, but also taking into consideration the impact that what you do can have on others. And the challenge there comes down to, okay, how do you quantify that? And how do you balance the two in a quantitative way? So in one respect, it's fairly easy to use mathematical tools to calculate what is the risk to me if I can understand what the probability is and what the impact is, and I can measure that inside of the organization. It's a little bit harder in the privacy world to understand, not only do I need to worry about that, but I need to balance it to be reasonable to everybody, including what is the impact to others. And I don't think we have a very good way of understanding what is the impact to consumers, what is the impact to third parties that are affected by our lack of controls that we've put, or safeguards that we've put in place from a security standpoint. So I just throw that out, and hopefully that stimulates some opinions from different others in this panel that I know will have coming at this whole thing from a different perspective.
Yeah, and just hearing you talk, I mean, what came to mind immediately was Colonial Pipeline. I mean, what's the impact to drivers up and down the East Coast who had to now spend their time in lines if they could even get gasoline at all?
Right.
Is there that, does one's responsibility to others extend? Well, how far does that extend? And without knowing that, how does one quantify the effect of that? I mean, mathematician Stan, kinds of looks at this, that, the threat of a risk is the probability, sorry, I turned that around. The risk associated with the threat is what's the likelihood of that threat manifesting times the cost of that threat when it manifests. And now, to your point, Barry, the cost to whom? The cost to Colonial Pipeline, that was $5 million, more or less, they paid out in ransomware attack, less the money they got back because the government recovered some of that, plus the cost of lost sales, plus the cost of, whatever else they had to clean up and so on, their IT services and all of that. But then you just brought in the $1 million question, maybe multi-million-dollar question in the case of Colonial, the cost to their customers. What's the cost to an IT vendor who gets hacked? And now all of their customers have been breached. And what if one of the IT vendor's customers happens to be a hospital, and we've already seen ransomware attacks allegedly causing the death of patients? Do you hold the IT vendor responsible for that death? And is that a manslaughter situation? Is that
Exactly.
Yeah, where does all of this go? Somebody else jump in. I mean, I see this.
I think the most important thing to me when it comes to risk and this is what I've witnessed, is the business always asks, do I mitigate it or transfer it out? Right? And how do I do that? Okay. I need to mitigate it, and if they can transfer it out, they will, is probably a better statement. And this might be a better question in terms of quantifying that. What do those mechanisms look like? Better question for Bob, because you've probably seen it the most. I mean, obviously in supply chain, you have responsibilities for any overhead regulations, but ultimately your contract with your supply chain is critical. And I would imagine that that's got to be where it starts. So help us, enlighten us, Bob. Where do you think that, when you start to quantify risk, what are you telling these leaders, since you're probably the most qualified risk professional here?
Well, then, first of all, then I apologize. Now you're being misled, or misleading. It's an interesting issue because there's been a general discussion. Look, when people do business, they do business in a way so as to minimize personal risk. So most people create vehicles to limit their personal risk. So that's why we have corporations, LLCs. That's why, there still are limited partnerships, all of which are designed to put a barrier between the risk of the ownership of the entity and the liabilities incurred by the entity. So, so that's one thing to look at, because the idea of putting an entity at risk, or making an entity responsible, looking at the potential entity risk, is not the same as ownership risk. The owners, so that's one thing to think about. And that's why there's such an interest in, when there ever is one of these claims, of how can you get beyond that entity. I think a second thing, and it's sort of brought up by what Barry said, is that in calculating risk, I would put it a little bit different way. I would say, who are your stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders in the company, which is another discussion that's been going on in the corporate world for as long as I've been practicing. And it goes back to, well, where companies say, well, I'm responsible for my ownership. I'm responsible for making decisions which are going to benefit ownership. So certainly in the public company arena, but they also are saying, well, what about the employees? What about customers? That's why you hold a company responsible for tainted goods. That's why there are lemon laws and things like that, because you don't blow it out. But on the other hand, I think commerce stops entirely if you expand the potential risk. I mean, if I had unlimited risk for the things that I did, I wouldn't do it. It's very simple. If somebody had unlimited risk for a car, so if anything happened to that car, if there is an accident, if there's something wrong, they are simply not going to engage in that activity. So I think that there's a balance out there. So one of the balances, and you see this in every privacy policy and every terms of use, at least the ones that I wrote, and I think the ones I've written, is that we're asking users to assume some of the risk. We're saying that we live in an imperfect society using imperfect tools. If we had perfect tools, you could not access us. If we had perfect tools, this would not work. And therefore, we're going to ask you to assume the risk and say, yes, that there's only a certain level of risk that we're willing to assume. Otherwise, things would get priced. I mean, there's so many different ways of putting it. And so it's a little bit, I mean, to me, it's a squishy area, because it goes back, what it really goes back to is, well, what's reasonable for us and what's reasonable for them? The other issue I'd say is that we govern risk between contracting parties very specifically. And this is something that comes up more and more in our groups. It's not just in IT agreements, but any kind of relationship agreement, any M&A transaction, any merger acquisition, any lending transaction, certainly, Jason, this is your world. There's an allocation of risk involved, and it's contractual. It's a whole different thing when you're talking about people who are a stakeholder but a third party. So let's take the Colonial Pipeline. It's one thing to say Colonial Pipeline services all sorts of people, but it doesn't sell gasoline. It's the vehicle by which gasoline, it's part of the ecosystem under which gasoline gets to your tank or unless, less and less do we worry about gas getting into tanks. So electric, whatever it is. To what extent are they responsible for the losses suffered by people who are secondary, tertiary, or even further removed from them? So
I have a question for you, Bob.
Sure.
I view the reason why we will never write a privacy notice is because I believe fundamentally that is a contract. A privacy notice is a contract between the organization and the people's data, that they're holding and managing. And that's why the deceptive trade practices is an issue. So that's actually a direct relationship, a direct contract, in my view. No, you're right. I would say it's not quite a contract. It's a statement. It's a statement, and it's required by anytime you collect data in almost every condition. You're required to have a privacy statement.
But the privacy statement is a statement of what you do that can be relied upon. It's almost like a contract. I mean, it doesn't follow a contract. I'm just being.
I get it.
I'm just being law school.
Yeah.
What's a contract? Offer, acceptance, things like that. But the fact is, there is a degree of that there. And thank you for not writing them, because I do. It's my business. A lot of people don't. A lot of people believe they're fully capable. But again, that is a one-on-one relationship. That is something between a user of a system or a user of a financial institution. I mean, I write privacy policies for people who collect information and aren't online. So it's not just that. But anytime you collect information, you have a privacy policy. That's an outward-facing privacy policy, and it can be relied upon. The question is, when this isn't just the personal information side, we've been very clear that it's not just personal information we're talking about here. It's the whole body of security of an entity, of an enterprise that we're concerned about. But when we're talking about somebody who, if there's a breach of a water system and the wastewater system, we can't use our beaches, or that we can't get water, or things like that. I mean, then the question is, it's sort of, we're going a little bit away from calibrating risk. We're talking about calibrating responsibility, which is, I think, a slightly different, which is a different thing, but very much related. And I think it gets back to the question of, are you going to be held responsible for this? Can you be held responsible? I personally think that one of the things that happens, and I know there are people who are on this call who might feel this way, is that if there's a breach, then the entity responsible for the breach is the victim. That the entity responsible is the entity, because they would tell you that entity is the one that is most, in other words, Colonial Pipeline is responsible for the breach because it was breached and it did not adequately cover it up. So the question that we are all trying to grapple with, and everyone who decided to call in on this is trying to grapple, well, really, to what extent are they responsible? And I think what we're saying is you're responsible if you haven't engaged in reasonable, and Barry, you would say defensible, security practices and procedures. And but I look at it, since my clients are very typically the people who have or will get breached, I don't deal with the individuals who are impacted by the breach. I look at that as a somewhat subtle question, or a multifaceted or difficult question, which is, where does, to what extent am I actually responsible for a bad actor?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think this, I apologize for taking this long, but it's one of the underlying issues that reflects, how we deal with risk, and your calculation of your risk, of how it's going to impact you, is part of the calculation. As you say, am I going to get sued? Am I really responsible? Or can I simply say, hey, look, I told you guys that it's an imperfect system. We take reasonable steps, and because what we're talking about here is really saying, when am I, as an entity, not going to be responsible for the loss of data, for exfiltration, and things like that?
Yeah.
Or not held responsible. That's the difference. I mean, I think that my definition of reasonable and defensible are different. Reasonable is still reasonable. The fact that you can defend yourself from action is defensible.
Yeah, I have to say, I was thinking that before. I mean, I would say, to me, I would say that they're closer to the same thing, because reasonable, there's actual security, which is binary. So you cannot actually get actual security because as I think Jason pointed out, there are humans involved, and humans do stupid things. It's the nature of humans. My career is based on people doing that. But reasonable to me is it's what everyone else sets the standard. We've already thrown away best practices. We got rid of that an hour and a half ago. So almost 2 hours ago. So
Right. Well,
yeah.
I want to jump in with another aspect of it, because I'll go back, Bob, to what you said at the beginning of this piece of the discussion around, if we were responsible for everything we did professionally, legally liable for everything we did, we wouldn't do things. I would not do security consulting in the absence of knowing that there's, a protection to my home and my 401k and all of those kinds of things. I would not put all of that in jeopardy. And yet we're finding at the same time where boards are being sued with an attempt to break the corporate shield because the board failed. The allegation is the board failed to ensure that the company was doing reasonable things, was doing defensible things. I look at, I don't know who the board of Colonial Pipeline is, nor do I know what I've read about Colonial Pipeline that in the press that's actually would hold up in court in an evidentiary way, but it's based on what I've seen. The board was out to lunch on this. And given that, is that legitimate reason for breaking the corporate shield in this case?
Well, boards are different. Boards have a different type of responsibility. Because the directors have a fiduciary obligation to the company and to their shareholders. So that's why I don't sit on boards and things like that. It's just, I'm not going to take that responsibility. I don't recommend it for people, although there's a desperate need for good qualified people. And there's a desperate need for qualified people who understand information security to be on boards of directors. But yeah, I think it's an allocation. In the end, we live with allocations of risk. One of the problems we have is the risk here is very, very hard to evaluate because it isn't the kind of risk that we have dealt with in business or in life for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
I mean, look, it's like driving a car. I mean, it's a big risk we take, especially here in Los Angeles, getting out on the road any given day. But we do it. I mean, I do it almost every day. Not every day.
And that comes back to risk tolerance.
Yeah, that's a key piece of it.
Yeah, and part of it is we're relying on other people that we have no idea who they are. When you get in an accident, you don't get in an accident with, well, my son one time rear-ended me, but typically, typically you don't get in an accident with somebody with whom you have a pre-existing relationship.
Right.
Typically it's a stranger, and there's a whole ecosystem which we've dealt with people who are required to have insurance and people who are required to have driver's tests. So there's a degree, and all of us ideally are careful and wait and know that there's a possibility that people run red lights and things like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I always had throughout my career was why is it so easy for me to start an IT company? I don't need to call consumer affairs like a cosmetologist does. I had to start an IT company. Right. So I'm wondering, is that where it starts? Is that where the issue is? Is that part of the problem? I'm not saying that that the problem is IT people, but generally speaking, it's got to start somewhere. There has to be some kind of a mechanism that qualifies organizations and when you talk about things like CMMC and risk management, I mean, it's there to manage risk for DoD, right? So, and it's suppliers, et cetera. So, so as you get into the risk transference question, as well as the risk mitigation question, inevitably you're going to have CSPs, as Chris said, cloud service providers. And we all know what that looks like. You sign an agreement as a user, and you sign away your rights as an individual, as part of the entity, and then a part of Secure the Village's role, is to protect the community, not just the businesses and the users, but what about the individuals that are signing in as users? and accepting these terms and conditions? Are they signing their risk tolerance away? You know, what exactly is going to be the vehicle that, besides, you know, regulations and CCPA and those sorts of things, but within business, is that the future? Is the regulatory train coming, and IT service providers are tied to the train tracks, and what other companies are tied to those train tracks, right? So that's what I look at as you know, is this inevitable based on what you've seen in other industries? Because it still revolves around risk. That's what they're trying to do, is, you know, make sure that you don't have risky companies or risky cosmetologists cutting hair. Why don't we make sure we don't have risky IT providers selling IT? So anyway, that's
Well, you don't need a license to have kids either. And if they did, I wouldn't have kids, because I passed the bar exam. I don't think I could pass the parent exam if there were one. So I think I'll just say that I think that it's very hard, that the things that you're mentioning about cosmetologists and dentists and, you know, hairdressers and things like that, a lot of it is because those are consumer protection, and that there is an interest of the state in protecting consumers because they recognize the inequality between a professional and a non-professional, and the fact that, you know, that there isn't much you can do. That also shows up in certain type of business relationships, because there are certain contracts of adhesion that simply won't be applied. And a lot of that goes into employment relationships. It goes back and forth. I can't tell you exactly where things stand right now because I don't do it, but can you impose mandatory arbitration, for example, and keep things out of court? Although companies have found ways to abuse that as well as anything else. You know, one of the things, I'm not sure we're going to get to the point where a business is going to, where there is going to be a governmentally mandated standard for IT professionals, particularly with respect to businesses. I will tell you that one of the things that is on my initial checklist with companies is a vendor vendor evaluation and vendor qualifications. And that goes for all vendors, but certainly IT vendors, and say, you know, let's find out about this. Where'd they go? Did they go to close cover before striking School of IT? Or did they graduate top of their class with a PhD and EE from MIT? You know, and maybe that's not even the right thing you want. Maybe you want somebody who's, you know, done other things. But, you know, I think on a business level, I personally don't think that we're going to get to the point where we're going to regulate IT people. There's actually such a backlash against regulation these days that I wouldn't be surprised if it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Just thrown out there.
So is that a place, Jason, for the insurance companies to require of IT companies that want insurance? That, I mean, you talk, any company wanting cyber insurance now has to, you know, pretty much have MFA, multi-factor authentication, as a, you know, price of entry, if you will. Can the insurance underwriters make things tougher on MSPs, given the exposure, not just to the MSP, but to
It's not a matter if they, it's not a matter if they can, they are.
They are, okay.
They're squeezing them like you wouldn't believe right now.
Okay.
So during the break, I just got another reject because they don't have MFA in place.
Wow.
So it's happening every day and twice on Sunday. So let's go back to the legal aspect of it. So I don't know, most of you, how, you know, Bob maybe does. I don't know if they're on panels of insurance companies, but the way that it works is that an insurance policy has two types of panels for cyber liability and cyber crime coverage. One is a cybersecurity company, the IR, the MDR, you know, their services that are contracted to defend and work with the insured if there's a breach. And the second one is the legal, the law firms. So you have breach coaches, you have the legal side of it when there's a breach that happens, okay? So what happens is, it is a horse race with law firms and cybersecurity companies to be embedded to get onto the panel of these insurance companies. And it's very political. Bob knows about how political it is. If you're on a panel of an insurance company, it's very, very challenging, and it's, you know, who scratches each other's back. So what we do is we posture with law firms and cybersecurity companies that are on panel with those specific insurance policies for the clients. Because at the end of the day, if they get a breach, they need to know who to call and who they're working with when shit hits the fan and where they need to go. So then they become part of, they meaning the cybersecurity and the law firm becomes part of their insurance policy, so they can implement certain things that they're lacking and let the underwriters know to get a quote. But the answer to your question is, they are squeezing every single sector right now. I know for our firm, for lawyers, I mean, I think Bob was saying lawyers were a top offender. Insurance people are a top offender too, and CPAs are pretty good offenders. So if you're in those sectors, as long as MSPs or anything technology that you're carrying PII, they're squeezing the wrench pretty tight right now. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of somewhat. I'm also thinking we want to move on to the discussion side of this. But Chris, you have anything to add to this part of the discussion? I think you're a natural to, yeah.
I can definitely vouch for what Jason's saying. Our insurance renewal, as again, this is on the managed services side of our business, was much more thorough this year in terms of, and to the point where we had to provide patch management reports of, you know, of our clients, anonymized, obviously, showing that we're doing this on their behalf. And this is not we have our own insurance, but this is our kind of third party, where if you know, it'll protect our clients if we end up having something go wrong.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting.
Well, first and third party is huge. Some of these policies are first and third policy because the exposure. So if you're carrying data of your clients,
Yeah.
you know, on the third party side, yeah, I mean, it's you know, what the exposure is to them.
And they're getting more sophisticated, because even though we try not to, we don't carry the data of our clients, right? They have their own tenants, but we configure them and have the ability to influence the security controls, which is everything, right? So it might be, yes, it's hosted on their system, but who configured it and who has the ability, if you hack us, to influence the security controls and ultimately get access to the data. So it's you know, it's good. I mean, it's good to see that the industry is evolving to this point, because in the beginning we were able to get third party, you know, back in 2014, it was I had a couple extra questions.
Oh yeah, now it's like I said, it's the wild west.
Yeah, and this is how I see, you know, like there's the legal side of this pushing down the, okay, what's reasonable perspective. There's the operational, what we do, pushing, okay, this question of reasonableness, and there's what the insurance companies are requiring if you want insurance. That also begins to describe, you know, what's reasonable. It's the three-dimensional vice, if you will. I want to move on to the discussion side of this around calibrating risk tolerance, which is, you know, again, look at the online, that link where we were just a few moments ago, and I want to take you through kind of three scenarios where we've talked about, you know, a cyber attack can keep you from serving your customers and your clients, a denial of service or ransomware, that sort of thing. You could be defrauded by a business email compromise, as another illustration of kind of bad things happening. And you could put your customers at risks as well, either by compromising sensitive information of your customers, or again, by preventing your customers from being able to do their business. The Colonial Pipeline case, I mean, all the gas stations that lost revenue because they couldn't get gas from Colonial Pipeline. So, and what we're going through, and you know, flows out of kind of combined work. Barry, you mentioned the Sedona conference as one illustration. And you also mentioned earlier the Center for Internet Security's risk management structure, and these kinds of scenarios flow out of that. But I want you to think about, you, the people in the audience, as you're watching this and going through this. So like scenario one, suppose a cyber attack prevents you from serving your customers or your clients. It could be ransomware, could be a denial of service attack, those kinds of things. Think about how, and not just think about it, write this stuff out and get with your executives and write this stuff out so you get it fresh in your mind. How long could you be down before it would begin to hurt your ability to serve your customers? If your target and it's, coming on to the holiday season and your computers go down, to the penny probably how much an inability to service your customers online, how much that's costing you. But if you're a law firm and you're down for a day, are you going to be able to recover that day? What's the impact is going to be? How long can you be down before it would begin to hurt? That's question one. Question two, how long can you be down before it begins to get painful? It's not just hurting a little bit. We got 10 partners and we're $1 billion firm, and each partner walks away, with zillions of dollars a year in compensation. We lose a little bit of money, it's chump change. But at some point, that little bit of money becomes a lot of money, and now it's painful to you. And then the third question always is, well, okay, how long could you be down before it's catastrophic? Now, we saw a law firm, this goes back, good God's 20 years, when the IT vendor truly messed up. And this law firm was down for pretty much a week. There's their servers and all, so they could do 20% of their work, not 100%. I mean, take that billable hours times the number of people that lost those billable hours to, you're looking at what potentially certainly painful, if not catastrophic. So that's kind of one of these questions. And then do the same thing with business email compromise. Take that as a scenario. If you're, make it up, Bank of America, and you lose $20,000 on a business email compromise that affects a piece of your business, that's a drop in the bucket to your total revenues and your total profits. But if you're a small business, if you're a nonprofit, that same $20,000, that could be real serious, catastrophic even for you. So think through, where does it begin to hurt? Where does it become painful? And where does it become catastrophic? So you begin to put some numbers on these things so that you begin to flesh out, kind of what you need to be protected against. And then the same thing around, what if you compromise sensitive information of your customers and clients, and now you're subject to all the laws that we just talked about in that last section, dealing with PII and whether it's CCPA or whatever. So all of those take you got to kind of know what laws apply, what your business looks like, how your business works, but thinking through, where does it begin to hurt? Where does it become painful? And where does it really become catastrophic? Because that's kind of, let's think about this. What was it, the quote of Einstein's? You can't solve today's problems with the same level of thinking. Thinking this way about these, and again, this goes to the Sedona conference and to the Center for Internet Security, NIST as well, for how to think about this. And then think about your own risk tolerance. I mean, some of us, will put our 401ks in nothing but AAA bonds because we're very risk averse. Others of us, and I'm, not one of them, but okay, I want to put my money in high flyers and cryptocurrencies and all. Just how risk averse are you? And begin to think about yourself, how risk averse you are relative to the risks, the cyber risks that we're talking about. So you begin to match yourself and your company, your organization, with what's out there hitting you right now, the amount of cybercrime. This is that kind of section 2, calibrating your risk tolerance. And I want to ask, the panel for some thoughts on this before we move on to our last section.
A couple of quick points. One is that there's been allusions to, and it really it's just easy to think through a little bit differently, allusions to focus on just cybersecurity risk, but it is fundamentally part of enterprise risk. It is like there's lots of risk out there, and the challenge of every organization is that everybody's making risk decisions every single day, and the problem of every organization, every business leader is they need to balance risk decisions and the cost of mitigation of risk decisions against where else they could put money to grow the business. I mean, it's just balancing act that it's just sort of natural. Everybody's, as you say, crossing the street, you make these kinds of decisions. So that's making it conscious.
Yeah.
Making it conscious by having an enterprise risk management program. And oh, by the way, the cybersecurity risk assessment flows into the enterprise risk management solution is really the right answer. Think about this, and think about it in a global way. The second comment I have is that there's three categories of how to approach these risk tolerance questions you asked about. The first one you said is, my business is down. Well, you know what? We've had business continuity planning for years and years and years, and that just totally falls into the space of business continuity planning and business impact assessments and determining what is the recovery point objective, what is the recovery time objective, what's the maximum time. It's like, it's easy to fit that into that context, and everybody should be. Like it is the likelihood of business being down because of an attack. There is a likelihood of that happening of some amount, and there will be an impact, and it's a natural place to deal with that. The others become a little more difficult because it's a loss of some amount of money from a ransomware attack where you can recover, or business email compromise, and the third category is the personal information loss and regulatory actions against you and class action suits against you and so forth is yet another category. And if you think of them as these separate categories of what is the ultimate threat to the organization, then it becomes a bit easier to think through them as individual things as opposed to is this gigantic ball of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Excellent point. Anybody else want to pick up on what Barry just said, this whole idea of enterprise risk as being one element of it? And to your point, do I spend my next $100,000, let's say, in cybersecurity or in hiring that new sales guy? Yeah. Well,
it's all about priorities.
Yeah. Well,
it's all about priorities. You've got money here, you got your total cost of risk here, you got your exposure here. Red, yellow, and green, those are the three risk assessments that we use.
Mm-hmm.
All about priorities.
Yeah.
What do they want? What do they go ahead and, how do they tolerate risk? I mean, that's a cliche. It's what do they prioritize? Do they care, do they care to be down? Do they care if, their clients get their information? I mean, it's all about their priorities, and everybody's got, their own agenda. So if their agenda is to say, okay, I'll get something remedial, but, I don't really need this if I don't want it because it's not going to happen to me. I'd rather hire, Joe, and Joe is, $1 million sales guy, and it goes on from there. So that's where I put in my, my effort and my energy into it.
It is totally about priorities. However, in order to ensure that you can say that I have implemented reasonable security, you have to actually put it on paper. You have to define that.
Right, but they got to be consciously. They have to go ahead and say, "Hey, look, this is a priority. I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I'm going to put everything down on paper." Some people who have even gotten breached, Barry, that are clients of ours, they still don't care about what they just. Oh, okay, I got breached. The insurance pays for it. And then the next thing you know, they're like, well, I don't know if I need this anymore. It's not going to happen to me again. So, I mean, again, it goes back to human beings. I mean, we have a short term, short-term thing. So at the end of the day, they're going to go ahead and decide what's the priority, what they look at as a risk and exposure versus what my priority is. But yeah, you have to put it on paper.
So,
Absolutely.
but just a
put it on
moment,
paper,
though.
and you have to define how you have decided what to do with safeguards as part of a risk assessment. And that's great. We understand that. I would say that I tell my kids all the time that everybody I've ever met thinks they think logically, and they don't.
Yeah.
Nobody
and they
does.
don't. And to that, Barry, common sense is not common.
Right.
That's right.
Okay, it is not common at all.
And
Go ahead,
how do you assign priorities when you don't understand the situation you're looking to prioritize? I mean, that's, to me, the biggest challenge in security. Well, not the biggest, there's lots of biggest, but one of the biggest challenges in security is that people don't know how to think about the subject. So when you say, should I spend this money here in security or hire the salesman? I've got experience that if I hire the salesman, I get $1 million worth of new sales coming up next year. But do I segment my network? So this is not something that maybe it's all in all the insurance company policies like MFA is, but it's a little more subtle. Do I know Barry's shrugging his shoulders. To us, it's
like,
not
yeah,
subtle at
hello.
all. It's basic. But to the business owners, the people who have to make these decisions, they don't see that. They don't, when their IT people come to them and say, we have to patch, and they say, well, what's that? I'm not going to pay you to patch my systems because I don't understand why I need to do it. That goes again to the heart of understanding as a prelude.
It goes down to I call it this way, shiny object syndrome.
Yes. Also,
that's exactly what it is. Most people have it, and once they have it, they can't shake it, and there's no drug for it yet. Maybe Pfizer will make one.
So
but
that's the segue into
drug is pain.
It is pain.
You feel pain.
How much pain?
Focus on it.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the biggest thing that I find that organizations motivate organizations to deal with security and to deal with privacy issues is the pain of a data breach. It stimulates action.
Yeah.
But even so, Barry, I talked about on the first segment really quickly about our client that's in the entertainment and entertainment field, and they don't have they don't have a cyber liability policy. They have a crime policy that's endorsed on anything electronic or over media. So it's a different type of policy. They got a social engineering with the wire. They still don't want to get a cyber policy. Think about that. Go ahead, Stan.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, what is it? Some philosopher said 100 and some years ago that some people stumble over the truth and they pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and walk on as if nothing has happened.
No,
I mean that
carrier paid it out. They have no need for it. So it's
right.
like trying to talk sense into them. It's futile. It's like banging your head against the wall.
But then also, I think part of what we have to recognize that we're doing here is, there are these technology adoption curves. There's early adopters, and then the curve begins to move up, and you finally get, the laggards who get it. We're not going to snap our fingers and now all of a sudden everybody gets it. We're going to gradually over time, and as the vice tightens, it'll happen more. But we're helping people that are ready for the journey to get on the journey train as much as anything else. And that's the segue to section 3. So all right, we've talked a lot around this subject and alluded to a lot of things about it, but what actually are some of the elements of reasonable security as they're finding their way into insurance operations and the law? And starting with the law, you mentioned earlier, Bob, Ohio now having a get out of jail free card kind of thing if they implement if a company implements an information security program based on the NIST cybersecurity framework or the Center for Internet Security version 8 or ISO 27001. If they do that, then and something, and a breach happens and they get sued for that, the fact that they've got their program built this way is supposed to be get out of jail free. But of course, the devil's always in the details, right? So I want you to kick off this section, Bob, because it's legal in this part. And unmute. Yeah. Now, really, we do want to hear from the lawyers.
Yeah, I
Please
got it.
unmute.
I definitely was speaking more eloquently when I was shutting up. So Ohio's had a law for a while now on this, and Connecticut and Utah have adopted laws which are very similar to it. They're not get out of jail free card. They're very limited. For one thing, they're not limited. They don't include contract actions, which, to go to Barry's earlier point, you know, if people would, I haven't seen any action on these, but probably someone would take a look at that and say, well, the privacy policy and the terms of use and all those things are actually things that they would use as a basis for a contract action as opposed to a tort action, which is what these would cover. Secondly, I find them rather unsatisfying in that basically they say, well, if you follow one of these, I pulled up one of the, like I think the Connecticut one I pulled up because that was the most recent one. You know, it says that there's certain standards which would meet the law. There include 3 different NIST standards: FedRAMP, ISO 2700 series, CIS's standard, HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, and to a certain extent, the payment card industry, DSS. But basically, you know, it's going to be limited, very limited in application, because it's only going to be for tort actions being brought in either Connecticut or Ohio or Utah, as the case may be. And I think that these are highly influenced by the desire of these states to be perceived as business friendly. I don't think it's going to have any particular impact, because states that are consumer oriented, and these are clearly, I mean, if you have an issue that is based on that, if you have a company to company issue, there's going to be a contract somewhere and someone's going to claim breach of contract. And so this is a tort, and you don't have torts. Generally, you don't have tort actions. If there's a contract, that generally precludes the possibility of a tort action. So if you're going to go in California, Illinois, New York, who knows what they're doing in Florida? I don't know anymore. But if you're going to go in one of those states, which comprise it, you know, where a lot of businesses are located, and where there are very strong consumer protection advocates, and then it doesn't really make it. So I think it's nice. It's a nice idea. I think, you know, it probably would limit some action, but it's not a game changer. I do think, though, that you know, when you look at these laws, the problem is that they list all these standards which everyone knows about. You know, we've already talked about NIST and CIS, and I don't know that we said ISO 2700, but or 27,000, whichever it is.
Mm-hmm.
They've certainly, I think it's 27,000. I think
27,000. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a typo. I was looking at. Yeah, definitely a typo. I have to tell wherever I got this thing. But you know, I have to complain to the internet about it. But you know, basically they've said, well, you know, you've got it, and they always have these kinds of limitations and saying, well, you know, if it also depends on your size, what's reasonable, what your resources are. So all of that is sort of built into these standards. We already know about these standards. I think that if you want to talk about what you really want to do with the standards, is first of all, you have to pick a standard. So you have to pick a standard that is applicable to your business. Again, I'll just say NIST because I'm aware of it. I've turned to hotel companies and say, there is a NIST standard which has been adopted, which specifically addresses your risks. It addresses the things that you see in hotels and property management. And so therefore you have a much better idea of what you need. Or as in the case of a defense contractor, you really don't have a choice. It's CMMC. So, but you pick a standard, and when Barry, you mentioned about if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. That's very good legal advice. That's what we tell people all the time. You should justify. You should, it's not just a matter of saying, here's, ISO 27004 came up. Oh, we'll use that one. It's just, or this one's the shortest or whatever. You pick one and justify why that one makes sense, and then actually follow it. And then as you follow it, I say this is a rinse and repeat thing. It's like, shampooing your hair. If I had hair, I would rinse and repeat. And that is that, you constantly, that these standards are changing all the time because the world changes and the risks change. So you have to have a basis. So if you do those things where you actually take it seriously and you identify a standard that is applicable to you, and by the way, it has to be achievable. It has to be something which is part of whether it's applicable is whether it's achievable. Look at it critically, follow the standard, or explain why you do it, follow the standard, explain why you might be deviating from the standard, and have this all down in writing, and to evaluate it, at least annually or whenever there's a change, whichever comes first, because your business is going to change, and therefore the applicability or your approach to the standard is going to change. If you do that, I don't know if there's a lot more you can do, and that is asking a lot. It's already asking an awful lot for people who are tremendously overburdened. And as everyone said here, we've got a tech deficit in terms of the number of people who can do these things. So anyway,
and I
so
think
that's
it's
my
really important. I got to note that you use the word change whenever things change. In IT, they change every 5 minutes, right? I mean, something needs to be patched. So arguably, I think documenting as well, what does change mean in terms of how often you need to take a look at things, right? So quantitative. So
Yeah.
Well, I'd say that there are two things which you look at. One of them is the calendar, and you should, like a lot of people here, I prepare a business plan for my business every year, and it starts on such and such a date. Everyone has a birthday. We have annual meetings. Pick it. First of all, just when that number turns from 2021 to 2022, whether it's January, December, or sometimes somewhere in between, you pick a date. And I would just say, I prefer summer and fall because there are a lot of laws which go into effect effective January 1. Like the revisions to the CCPA, the new Colorado Act, the Virginia Act are all going to go in. Well, Colorado Act actually goes into effect July 1st, so maybe I'm wrong, but you pick a date. The other thing is that it takes attention to the business. And that means that on the governance side of the business, you have to recognize that if you change your operations, if you make a meaningful change in your operations, then this has to be part of the checklist, because you're going to be looking at employment issues, you're going to be looking at space issues, you're going to be looking at compensation. Well, you've got to add information security. This is one thing you ought to consider anytime when you change what you do. Some companies are more aware of it than others. And then the last thing is, I think somebody's got to keep an eye out every couple months and make sure that there hasn't been a new version of the standard you're working on. There's always some lead time for those. They don't say, oh, it's, sometimes it's like, on Patch Thursday, it's Patch Thursday, right? Tuesday,
yeah.
Oh God, that's why I missed them. So I'm not in charge of patching. I just tell people they have to patch. Right. So, there's very rare that you get, on Patch Tuesday, they'll say, just drop what you're doing, patch this. And if a patch comes up on a Friday, that forget it. I mean, stop what you're doing and patch, because otherwise they wait till Tuesday. But generally, you're going to have some lead time as the standards change. You just have to, you can put a Google alert and they'll tell you when the standard changes. It's not that hard, but it does take attention.
Mm-hmm.
So I am curious about the one other thing, this issue of, let's call it the alphabet soup of the NISTs and the CISs and the ISO. There's just so many. but this particular movement that is related to privacy laws that are kind of popping up everywhere in every state. Everyone was looking at federal. Hey, when is federal going to throw something out? And when it comes to risk and quantitative risk, I don't think that even if something did emerge that there would be anything quantitative at all. But when I see states like Ohio, and I listen to the lieutenant governor's verbal message on this issue of like, hey, if I write my own law, then I got to update my law all the time. I don't want to do that. I'm going to leave it up to the experts. I'm going to leave it up to NIST. That way I don't, then it's just administrative for me. I'm not an expert at this. That was the position. I'm wondering whether that's a reasonable position for the state to take. And as other states consider their own laws, I'm questioning the issue of, has Fed been waiting for each state to make their choices? That way they can at least go in with eyes wide open, knowing what each state might want. And that's kind of waiting for the states, the majority of them, to get through this. Or what's your perspective on that, Bob? I think that's where we're all scratching our heads going, why can't we just have one? So
my perspective, so I have a bad attitude about legislation generally and legislation in the United States more specifically, and Congress altogether. I think, first of all, the lawmaking in the United States tends to be anecdotal. So we don't deal with broad ideas. So for instance, difference between GDPR and let's say the Cal CPA and others, the GDPR is actually based on 7 principles. I mean, I have one partner, Mike Gold, who has a copy of them, puts them on his wall, because he says, you follow those principles, you're going to follow GDPR. We don't do that. We say somebody got hit by a car, so we're going to adopt a law about a crosswalk at the corner of 7th and Fig, something like that, and not say, well, what's the underlying issue? But beyond that, I don't think the Fed, I don't think that the Congress is waiting for anything. I just think they're incapable. They're incapable of taking the action that it requires, because there is nothing which is not politicized. Secondly, I would note that California, our now vice president, who was a real champion of privacy and security and did some great work, said, if there's that when she was a senator, she said, I am not going to let a federal law, privacy law, be passed that preempts California's law, because we are out to protect our citizens. So I think that if there is what a federal law might do is I think, first of all, I think the most likely thing is they will expand the FTC's authority, but it's going to be a floor authority. It's not going to create a ceiling. It's not going to be truly preemptive. There might be something like a uniform data breach response, which would be nice, but and that would save a lot of trouble. And Jason, it would make your life probably moderately easier, because you could figure out a better cost structure for that rather than having to look at every state. So they might nibble at the edges, but I don't think there's going to be a broad thing. In terms of what you said about Ohio, I mean, these states are crazy. I mean, I'm trying to remember now, for a lot of reasons, my brain isn't functioning the way it should. And I posted on this, so I really should remember, is that there was a governor who complained that the local paper had found and had publicized the fact that there was a weakness, that there was a security breach, and he's suing the paper for having done that. So, I mean, that's not even a First Amendment issue. That's a truth issue there. But the idea that a state would say, we're going to, and by the way, this is what Ohio, Connecticut, and Utah have done. They basically said, we're going to let you pick a standard. And it specifically says, if you don't adopt changes to the standard as they change, then you no longer can take advantage of this safe harbor, if we'll call it that. I don't really have a problem with that. I think that one of the problems, as exemplified by this governor, I don't remember who it was, is that you've got people in the legislature who don't know anything about this stuff. I mean, the guys who wrote the California Consumer Privacy Act are clueless on privacy.
Yeah.
They're clueless on e-commerce. They don't understand how e-commerce works. That's why I have clients who are spending $1 million trying to comply with it. So I think the idea that they would give the possibility that allow experts to weigh in on this, I don't know that I have a problem with that. I think it might be a good response. I mean, we effectively do that the same thing because we leave so much to regulators anyway. And say that, so we have this whole class of regulators at the state and federal level who have achieved subject matter expertise, and we're entirely dependent on them for the implementation of our laws.
Yeah, it just makes it really hard for us to blueprint for our customers what they need to do. You know, and I think everyone is hoping to see something that is more common, and we're looking at the privacy attorneys and the tech attorneys like you and saying, you know, okay, what about this one and what about that one? And I think we're all hopeful for something uniform, at least in some respect, because that's how a lot of the IT people and the IT community ticks. Show me
I think it would make life a lot easier, but I don't think, by the way, I don't think it would necessarily result in better security.
Yeah,
I think it would just result in easier compliance.
I think one of the pieces we have to look at here as well is compare, let's say, the Center for Internet Security controls against the NIST cybersecurity framework. And I'm a fan of both of them, but part of the NIST cybersecurity framework, it does a nice job of, okay, here are the 5 functions, you know, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Then there's 19 or so categories of things to do inside of each of those: identify, protect, and so on. And then they get into subcategories with the explicit statement that, well, here are some subcategories that might work for some companies, but everybody has to find their own subcategories. So there's like, you're building this edifice that ultimately is on sand. You know, you go figure it out is basically what the NIST CSF says. And then you look at the Center for Internet Security version 8, you know, item 1, you know, have an inventory of all of your hardware, have an inventory number 2 of all of your software, and so on. Very much more explicit, but then it begins to leave out a lot of what I see as the leadership and management side of things. So it's like, if you want to get explicit, follow the technology trail. If you want to get broad coverage, follow the NIST with leadership and management and, you know, all of those things. But there's still that inherent gap where, again, the devil's in the details. And ultimately it's going to be the courts that get to set this whole thing straight, because, you know, that's where the lawsuits are going to go. But, you know, that's, boy, you talk about anecdotal, Bob.
Yeah, I don't know how many of these things are going to go to court.
Yeah,
I mean, these things, there haven't been a lot that have gone to court. These things you get procedural motions and then it goes on, but who knows? And by the way, my faith in judges to decide, or juries to decide on things of a highly technical matter is only slightly greater than our legislators. So
yes. Yeah, we both share some cynicism there, and you know, but yet it leaves us with the question, and Stephen Bernard kind of said it as he was leaving one of the chat things, is one of my takeaways, quote, "It depends. There's no one answer." And that's the whole premise of this whole webinar is to that, but we can still begin to calibrate this. And Barry, go ahead, jump in.
First off, I think that there is an answer.
Okay.
And the answer, as Chris said earlier, is do something. Do something. Don't sit back and do nothing. You have to start by doing something.
Okay.
Then you can define that is an answer, absolute answer. Then you can define, do a much better job of having an approach, define a clear approach that says, and this is how I decide what I'm going to do. And you can choose frameworks, or you can choose prescriptive solutions, but whatever you do is doing something. And then as Bob pointed out, make sure you don't do it one time. Do something on a regular basis and when things change. And if you're doing these things, you're a whole lot better off, and there is an answer. it's not more complicated than that. I agree with everything Bob said about all the laws. I have no hope that we will have a national law. And if we do have anything, it'll be like HIPAA, it'll be non-preemptive. So it's like not a bad thing to have a floor, but I don't expect anything out of the national government. Although where the pressure will really come from, I mean, there's two pressures, right? It's large IT organizations trying to pressure them to limit how much they have to do. And this second part of it is pressure from the rest of the world. GDPR is putting pressure on the US to actually do something because it's limiting what organizations can do, and it's raising the cost of what organizations have to do with data transfers and all this kind of stuff. So there's external things that are pressing, which may end up helping us create some floor, non-preemptive floor, but that's no good. I think that the challenge, I also agree with Bob about the challenges of legislatures. If you look at that, if you listen to that interview from the lieutenant governor from Ohio, he's absolute proof that he admits it 5 times, 10 times in that interview. He knows nothing. He specifically says, "I know nothing." Right? I'm going to assume that this is all fine. And when he's pressed on it 3 times, how are you going to know that an organization has implemented the NSF privacy framework? And he could not answer the question because there is no answer. I mean, if they wave their hands, as far as I could tell, he said he would have decided they're fine. They've implemented something. They wave their hand, it's not a solution that ultimately works for anybody, especially if they're faced with some attorney general action from Ohio, and they say you have to fix this. No, by the way, you do have an out. You can fix it in 30 days. And we won't press our charge. 30 days to implement the NS, a CSF framework. It's like, yeah, right. They don't have a clue what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and what you said, the pressure that is coming to do something. One of you said it takes attention. That's another piece of it. But this pressure is coming first. Just the cost of crime is pressure. The insurance companies, Jason, that you want coverage, you got to do A, B, C, D, and E. That's pressure. The laws from GDPR and other and CCPA and the follow-ons was a CPRA is CPRA as well, putting pressure on lawsuits, whether the judges know what they're doing, the juries know what they're doing or not. As guilty verdicts come down, if they do, that's more pressure. And then it comes down to, so what's a reasonable organization to do managing all of this? And I think, even to the point, it depends. That's on the specifics. Are we all agreed? Be a good question that you got to do something. You got to have a program. You got to be managing this in a way that's visible. That's, here. Let me show you how we're managing it. Here's our artifacts,
Yep.
etc. Is that a minimum standard at least?
From a privacy framework, I also had a recent conversation with another privacy attorney who's been in the privacy role for 20 years. And her view was you need a framework of some sort. And there's no framework is going to be any good in a privacy program unless you understand what your obligations are. You've built in accountability for the organization and through the organization, and you have some way of reporting on where you are in that process. But it all starts with, you have to have a program, you have to have governance for both security as well as privacy.
Yeah. Chris, is that consistent with CMMC? I mean, the way those 3 standards are in some sense incorporated built into CMMC?
Yes, they're definitely mappable. I think the one differentiation that CMMC makes is that the levels. And so level 1 is not one that requires documentation. And again, that's if you're not dealing with the sensitive data. So there is a level that CMMC calls out that says, hey, you don't have to, it's not that it's not a program, it's more of an informal, and I go back to that example of the landscaper, on Camp Pendleton. There's 17 basic controls you need to be doing, but maybe you don't need to go all the way to documenting it and maintaining those documents and managing it. So that's one distinction that CMMC has made, yet to be seen in operation, kind of how that is affected.
Yeah, George, what are your thoughts on that?
And I think, well, I agree. Yes, Chris is right on about the CMMC side, but when the thought on using a framework in general, especially a NIST framework, it seems to be the most logical path for every organization to take foundationally, not necessarily the only framework to follow, right? So you need crosswalks, and you need to map to whatever other exposures that you consider to be critical to your business in arrears of a regulatory impact assessment, hopefully. So, but the foundational concept behind using a NIST CSF or NIST PF does not necessarily map exactly to a NIST 853 or a NIST 800-171 in terms of all the things that you have to do in the controls areas. So, and I think this applies for any framework you decide to follow. There's going to be crosswalks, there's going to be mappings that exist, and gaps in some cases. And so I think what you're going to find is a lot of organizations are going to either need mini GRC or a more mature GRC, which means governance and regulatory compliance softwares. Generally, that industry has changed. I think it was Gartner and Forrester, was it 5 or 6 years ago, said GRC is dead. We're going to break it into these other industries, and one of them is enterprise risk management and cyber risk and those sorts of things. And so that's because of GRC could mean compliance with hazmat, right? So and that's where it gets a little bit complicated. What I run into when in some situations is you run into maybe an enterprise organization that has a risk management team, and they have risk managers, but none of them have cyber experience, nor are they gearing up to train for it. And so it becomes a gap situation between security and IT, generally traditional brick and mortar businesses, and the risk management teams. And so I don't think there is a great answer for that right now, because these GRC platforms that have been around for ages that are still floating around in these larger businesses, I think they're the ones that are buying these additional modules. But the frameworks, using NIST, it doesn't seem to be in the picture, right? And so whether or not that is going to be sensible for a really large organization to have NIST, I think is more of a question as to what impact does it have for them. And I've heard a lot of privacy attorneys tell me it's probably a good thing, NIST PF, NIST CSF, because that might be where things are headed. But any framework really is what I've heard a few privacy attorneys say, just use something, right? And so I think it remains to be seen whether or not NIST CSF, NIST PF is going to be the ultimate answer. We do know that the scientists who develop the internet are encouraging that path. So we'll see.
Well, yeah. I think this ties back, George mentioned it, right? The idea of mapping security controls and mapping between frameworks. I think this also goes back to the regulatory. I agree with Bob and Barry. I don't have much hope for a central, but what I think there, and I'd be interested in your guys' opinion on this, what I think there is hope for is potentially reciprocity among maybe states or standards, or especially with the international community. I think they really push for that, where, okay, I have CMMC, certification, or GDPR, I've done this, that gets you this credit in this other framework or with this other state or regulatory body. And that might be kind of the best we could hope for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The compromise, so to speak. Compromise for the compromise.
And that's a great approach. And ISO 27001 and CMMC, the advantage of those is that you can be certified.
Yeah, they're certified. They're certified.
Yeah.
Whether or not a certification, and back to my original point of where's the fire inspector, right? Well, what can be certified? Now, SOC 2 has been hot for ages, obviously accredited. It can be certified, right? And so it's almost like you expect every service provider that you work with, large scale service provider, has SOC 2, especially IT providers that are offering data center space. So,
And I'll push back somewhat on that because we do a lot of reviews of SOC 2s, and they are so very specific to the scope. What exactly is the SOC 2 scoping? And so, yes, you can accept this as being certified, but then the companies we often talk to say, oh, we have a SOC 2 covers, they don't say it covers this. They think they're either think themselves or they're trying to sell that the SOC 2 covers all of this, but it only covers this. So there's a caveat emptor here in all of this as well.
Agreeable, and I think that's the challenge. And I've got, believe me, that SOC 2 is everywhere, and I understand why organizations chase it, especially those that are offering cloud services at a large scale, and data center services and those sorts of things. It's kind of the de facto, but the question then becomes, how does this address all the other issues that we are dealing with, like data mapping and data management from the perspective of privacy, right? So you can't have cybersecurity without privacy now, sorry. So, and does SOC 2 address that, right?
Well, there is a privacy module for SOC.
There is, there is a module. The question is how does it map? And I haven't done any NIST PF mapping or any regulatory. I haven't done any CCPA default controls yet, in terms of privacy, what security controls require, to address the privacy issue. And that's where the reasonable comes in.
Right.
So you get to choose. And I think that's why a lot of companies like it, because I get to choose what reasonable is. So,
yeah. Okay, so this is good. I want to move on to the third section of the handout that everybody has. We put together here 25 information security management practices, not suggesting that you must do all of them to be reasonable. I would hold, if you're not doing any of them, you are de facto not reasonable, because I think we've all agreed you need a program. You need to have gotten started at least to be reasonable. But what I'd like you in the audience to do is to take this. We've identified to a certain extent which ones are strategic, which ones are tactical, although there's always overlap as to what do we mean by strategic and tactical. But this becomes a part of thinking about cybersecurity. Do you have a named executive responsible for information security management? That's number one, because I think everything we're saying, management, you got to get started somewhere and manage. There's got to be that management piece. But then you get down to some of the details. We haven't, and I'm just picking this at random, we have documented incident response and business continuity plans that are updated, trained, and tested at least annually. And this goes to one of the questions Michael Pulte pointed in the chat earlier. Okay, certainly I want all of our clients to be doing this. Is that required for reasonableness? The laws and the courts are going to sort that out, but certainly from a operational perspective, it's reasonable. It's built into 800-171, the underpinnings of CMMC. It's built into the Center for Internet Security stuff and the NIST cybersecurity framework. I would hope, Jason, that when a company is looking for insurance for ransomware, that the insurance underwriter says, I want to see your plan. I want to make sure you've tested it. I want to see that you're doing tabletop exercises, at least once a year, if not once a quarter. Is, in your experience, are they doing that yet, or is that still?
No, they just have a list of the demands for them to get a quote.
Yeah.
But if there's a NIST assessment, which is what I'm doing with my clients, that plan and that assessment, once it's signed up, becomes part of the insurance application to make you more desirable as a risk.
Mhm.
And that's going to be the standard, I would say, within about a year to 6 months, like, no, a year and 18 months. That's where it's headed right now.
Mhm.
What's the formal name for those again, Jason? Is it an application guarantee, application warrant? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think that's what it is, George. Yep. And that's going to be, hey, we want to see this right now. It's not there yet. And the carriers and the underwriters got to pivot to it. And that's going to be a pretty seismic shift once that becomes like, hey, you have to show me X, that assessment.
Yeah.
And this to go ahead and get a quote. I mean, right now, people are just squabbling over, hey, it's based on revenue and sectors of industry and PII and your exposure. And, oh, my revenue went up $500,000, so my premium increased $2,000, and they cry about it. They're crying about it right now.
Yeah.
But now they're going to, and we're telling everybody right now, next year, prepare to go ahead and do X, Y, and Z and have, the NIST something in place to do an assessment. If not, you're not going to get coverage. Not only just for the cyber portion of it, for the technology errors and omission, anything that has to do with technology. If you have a technology errors and omission policy that is concurrent with the cyber component and the cyber crime component, that's going to be the golden standard.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is going to be. And I'm telling all of my clients and prospects, when I get a prospect, usually I'm like the 15th broker involved. I'm just telling you the industry. I mean, that's the way it is. And I say, look, you're coming to me because you don't want to pay $9.99 a pound. You'd rather pay $5.99 a pound. I said, the industry has changed. I mean, it's the wild, wild west right now. And I have to set expectations and say, you can go around and shop around all you want. And, that's human nature. And they don't understand the insurance industry at all if they're doing that. It's all about the relationships and what contacts they have, but you need to put X, Y, and Z in place. So yes, that's coming down the pipe.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I think just helps, converge this whole area as well. So I want people, take that, information security risk profile, look at those 25 things, sit down in your company, match them up against the risk tolerance in section 2 and what you're legally responsible for and so on, and what threats you can expect up in section 1. But think through this. To your point, Barry, that it's a Nike slogan, just get started. Let's do something here. Barry and I did a webinar a little while ago dealing with the idea you can't boil the ocean. And think through this as a methodical, continuous improvement became one of those mantras back in the 90s. Total quality management is an illustration of it. It's that same thing. Have a program so that you continually strive to get better, and you do that. One of the things we've prepared for you to help you on your journey is, and I've put the link in the chat box several times already, is just SecureTheVillage.org/reasonable-security-2021. In it, you've got this risk profile. You've got the 2020 conference, which was a year ago. Next year, when we do Reasonable Security 2022, we'll include this. There's a couple of things on the threat landscape. The internet crime reports from the FBI, the Verizon most recent data breach investigation report, the legal references. There's a reference to the Sedona conference. Being a mathematician, I love that, notwithstanding its limitations, as we've discussed. A lot of Secure the Village resources, webinars we've done. We did 3, as I mentioned, on the California Consumer Privacy Act. And actually, I've only got 2 of them listed. No, I've got all of them. Sorry, all of those. references for operational security, the Center for Internet Security stuff, some NIST documents, and again, a lot of webinars that we've done over the years here in Secure the Village with many of you. Barry and Bob, you've been a part of those, and George and Chris, Jason, you as well. You're a part of these resources. Insurance references, again, Jason, you and Kurt Sue did that webinar a while ago. And then I've also listed, there's 3 nonprofits you should know about beyond, in addition to Secure the Village. One's the Cyber Readiness Institute. I'm on their Small Business Advisory Board. They produce materials to help small business, the SMB world, including a cyber readiness program and a cyber leader certificate program that you can get. They're basic. These do not go, they're not deep in the trenches. They're much more overview, but they're there for nonprofits. If you're a nonprofit watching this, there's an organization, Sightline Security, headed by a young woman, Kelly Masada, PhD out of Purdue. She works exclusively with nonprofits to help nonprofits manage this. And then the Cybercrime Support Network as well. They just honored Secure the Village as their cyber champion of the month. And they serve, in this case, individuals and small businesses on the victim side. If you're a victim of cybersecurity, they're quite valuable. And again, on the small business and on the individual side. So don't forget those either. But take advantage of those. One of the things that's on the references here that we did in Secure the Village, it goes back before CCPA went into effect, but was the CCPA kind of in the back of our minds as we did it, was could we describe a minimum set of practices that if you were subject to CCPA, you should do. It goes to Steve Krantz's question, should Secure the Village take a public stand on some of these issues? We've done that with CCPA and what's minimum reasonable. Not a public stand that this is what it should be, because that's not our role so much, nor are we smart enough or knowledgeable enough to do that. But here's something that we can use as a straw man, as a floor to think again, how do we think about these things becomes such a critical piece of it. So that's on the reference list, and it's part of the Secure the Village library that I encourage everybody to go to. We're coming up at the bottom of the half hour, ready to go. I just want to give you all final words to organizations that need to manifest information security, need to figure out their own reasonable program so that they can run with it. Who wants to jump off? And Jason, go for it.
Things are getting worse in the insurance industry by the day. The capacity is shrinking. The carriers are pulling off of risks. Insurers don't understand what next year is going to bring or their next renewal is going to bring. And it's a constant fight. And I would say by the time we do this talk next year, it's going to be worse by 10 to 15 fold of what's going on, and the premiums are going to go through the roof. I mean, that's what I'm looking at right now. While the 3.5 hours we're talking right now, I got a couple of renewals that came in, and 2 of them got pulled off because they don't have the proper procedures. What's reasonable, George, we're talking about, they just don't get it. And as long as, I have a saying, most people are either checked out or burnt out, and they just don't understand what's going on. And our job is a lot harder. It's a lot harder to transact insurance, educate, and then go ahead and get quotes. And it's tough. It's a tough time right now in the insurance, and it's only getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
So the takeaway message is for anyone who's got a business is to get compliant and to put policies and procedures in place that will help you, if you do have an insurance policy, to get one and also protect your business and your assets.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, yeah. Chris, you want to jump in, some final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a business owner, this can be a very overwhelming. Boil the ocean was a term that was used quite a bit. This stuff can be very overwhelming, and I think it just goes back to what's been said multiple times in this, which is, starting, even attending this podcast is a start. And at the end of the day, this is coming your way, whether you like it or not, probably from a regulatory standpoint. But really all of these compliance frameworks and regulations are similar in the sense that right now they want you to develop that program, and they want you to have that lens, which is a risk lens. And Barry said it, right? It's actually, they want the function to be at the enterprise level and cyber to be an input, but they're going to drive it from the cyber kind of lane. So start with that program, and then you can iterate on it. Don't get so caught up in how to get to that end state, because it's going to ever be evolving over the course of time.
Yeah. Good point, Barry.
Just to reemphasize that it is not about boiling the ocean, it is about starting. It's like, and you can get to a place where you feel comfortable if you have said, I will implement a program, I'll start something, I'll start it today, I'll find a way to iterate it. It is a reasonable approach, it is a defensible approach, and just avoiding the problem by doing nothing because you think it's too big isn't even necessary. You can do something. You can do something now.
Yeah. Well said, George.
Well, let's face it, hackers are criminals with a mindset that a pyromaniac's mindset, they will steal your data and set it on fire. So you have to put yourself in a position just like you would in defending your home, from a fire. Have defensible space. It's really important to use minimum reasonable security. It's the same thing, it's just in digitally. So your business as well as your home, whether you're a consumer or you are a business leader trying to, or let's just say you're grappling with this issue, which I think many are. It is sensible to make sure that minimum reasonable security is on your agenda, and you learn as the CEO, as the board, to lead it. Don't put on the blinders. Get involved like you would with any other department, CEO and CFO as well. So, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Again, really, really well said. I've left you, Bob, for last as the attorney. So you kind of be on me because I'm facilitating this, but you get the penultimate word on this. But you and I have talked about leadership enough over the years.
I really have to say, I think George said it right. I mean, this is something that notwithstanding what Jason said, and I know I can understand that my clients are starting to go through this and it's very painful. Maybe that'll get them on the ball. But the fact is that this is something where you can't, you have to do something. The only way something is going to happen if it is through, as at the leadership levels of an organization. This isn't something they can push down. It's not something they have to do, but they have to learn about, they have to learn enough to evaluate it. The traditional requirement for corporate leadership is to evaluate and decide what risk to assume, what risk to avoid, and what risk it can lay off on others. And I think corporate leadership has very often been unwilling to do it in this area for a number of reasons. I've written about it before, I'm not going to try it there. But this is a core competency of corporate leadership. And they really, if they assume the mantle, that will actually get us to the point where something happens.
Yeah, that's a great last word. I mean, you and I, all of us, have talked about the leadership challenge in cybersecurity.
Yeah.
As long as we've been talking about this stuff.
And my big question is how many just don't know how to do it?
Yeah.
Versus those that, they're brave and maybe they want to try, but
Hey, Lee, I was an English major, you know.
Whether or not.
I can, this is not so far that it's not something that requires such specialized knowledge that you can't do it. It requires will, and it requires a commitment.
Yeah,
It's not something that can't be done.
yeah, that's true. Successful businesses already know how to manage operations. They know how to manage sales. They know how to manage finance. The executives didn't come into their position knowing all of those things. They came in knowing one or another of them. I mean, so many companies run by marketing people or whatever, but they learn enough about operations to know how to lead in operations if they're, doing it well. And it's the same here. I'm of the belief that so much of the problem is just people. This is not simple. That's what the video at the beginning showed. And we in Secure the Village have the opportunity to help organizations kind of wrap their head around this new stuff. And that's what we do. And that's what today has been all about. That's why it's not just a few operations folks or just the law or just the insurance, but it's all of this. And, we could have added a psychologist perhaps to the panel. Because that's another key piece of it. But by God, first, we can do it. And second, we have to do it. I mean, imagine a day, and let's hope we never get there, where the insurance companies just walk away from this and they say, okay, we're not covering it anymore. It's just, we can't get our hands around our loss control.
It's going there, Stan.
And it's going there.
It's going there. It's
Yeah.
going there pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And they don't want to pay. I mean, I had a client that went from a $10,000 to $50,000 deductible because they had a claim in 1 year.
Yeah.
Think about that. It's going
That's
there.
right. So it's going there. We know we're in a deep battle for the future of who leads the 21st century, if you will. The autocrats who can tell their people what to do. By God, you're going to do security, and here's the way it is. And if you don't, we're throwing you in jail. That kind of thing, versus here in America, where it's voluntary, as I believe it should be. But at the same time, there's responsibilities for people to step up and protect themselves, their companies, and in protecting their companies, they're helping America, if you will. I mean, it's all of us. We're all in this together. That's what that video is all about. That's what Secure the Village is all about. So I'm so grateful to the 5 of you for having given of your time, and of the 30 or so people that have been on this webinar at various points of it, for taking some of their time. I truly hope we've helped kind of calibrate this space, certainly given some good ideas for moving forward. Certainly the idea, just get started, just do it, pay attention, that sort of thing, and stay connected with us. I mean, we're out. Secure the Village is out month in, month out with programs that help move this whole thing along. So I want to thank you on the panel, thank our attendees, and it's an open question. Ultimately, it is one we will evolve our way into. But let's hope when we come back here a year from now, we've gotten greater clarity. There's, the insurance companies know how to do this in an affordable way, which means businesses have to understand their obligations also in an affordable way. And so that we come back a year from now with deeper insights into what this is, and able to take this to the next level. So thank you all. With that, happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we are
Thank you.
adjourned. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Guys.
Bye-bye.